There's a certain hour of the night when the world loosens its grip. The highways go quiet. The hospitals dim their lights. The ocean sighs against the dark. And the old houses, the ones with bones made of timber and breath made of dust, begin to remember things they haven't spoken of in years. If you're awake now, you're listening from the other side of sleep. Maybe you're driving. Maybe you're lying in bed with the lights off and the curtains drawn. Maybe you're sitting alone in a quiet room, letting the dark spill in around the edges. Wherever you are, welcome. Tonight, we're tuning into the small, forgotten spaces of the world. The roads that never end. The empty hospital wards where laughter should have been. The forests that keep their debts like ledgers carved into bark. The frequencies that only speak at 3 a.m. The fog that walks with you. The corners of the house where nobody ever looks until it's too late. These are not loud horrors. They do not chase, or scream, or bleed. They wait. They lean. They listen. They learn the way you breathe in the dark. So, find a comfortable place. Leave a small light on, if it makes you feel better. Or turn it off, and let the room be honest with you. This is your late night broadcast. And if you can hear my voice, then you're already on the right frequency. Let's begin the route to nowhere. The rain had already stopped by the time Calder Wind pulled his car into the lay-by near the river, but the road still glistened like a black ribbon, slick and reflective, swallowing the streetlights and long, bending streaks of gold. He could still hear the faint hiss of water retreating into drains. Midnight air always smelled different after a storm, metallic, as if the night had been polished, clean, and left to dry. He worked nights because they were quieter, cleaner. Nobody wanted conversation at 2:37 a.m. They just wanted to disappear from one place and reappear in another. Calder could respect that. He wasn't much for talking either. His phone chimed softly. New request. Pickup. Mariner Road overpass. Drop off. Hartwell Cemetery. Hartwell Cemetery. Passenger. Anonymous. Calder frowned. The system rarely allowed anonymous profiles anymore. And Hartwell Cemetery. He hadn't heard that name in years. The city had fenced it off. Sinking earth. Unsafe terrain. Nobody went there now. But the fare price was absurdly high. He accepted. The map drew a thin blue line through the veins of sleeping neighborhoods and out toward the fog-damp back roads. Somewhere under the dashboard plastics, the car hummed like a contented animal. Calder rested his hands on the wheel, knuckles pale in the dimness, and told himself there was nothing unusual about driving a stranger to a place that shouldn't exist on the app anymore. The overpass appeared like a shadowed ribcage stretching over the road ahead. Streetlights thinned here, giving way to a darker shade of night. Beneath the overpass, motionless as a stone, a woman stood at the curb. She wasn't dressed for the hour, or for the season. A slate gray wool coat buttoned high at the neck, and beneath it a soft green dress, the shade of drying leaves. Her hair hung straight and dark, pinned behind one ear, and in her arms she cradled something wrapped in white cloth, held close against her chest with reverence. Calder slowed to a stop. The clock on the dash blinked past 2:44 a.m. For a moment, she didn't move. She simply looked at the car, assessed it, as if weighing whether it too carried a ghost. Then she opened the rear door and slipped inside without a word. The soft smell followed her, sweet, overwhelming, unmistakable. Lilies. Funeral lilies. Calder's throat tightened a little at the scent. It was too strong, too fresh, like the entrance hall of a place where people whispered because permanence had ended. The woman settled into the back seat, never loosening her hold on the white-wrapped bundle. He saw only the faintest edge of lace peeking from the cloth, delicate and old-fashioned, like something salvaged from another time. Her voice, when it came, was calm and exhausted, as if emotion had been wrung out, folded, and put away. "Please don't look at me in the mirror," she said gently. He paused. "Sorry? The mirror," the woman repeated. "The rear view. I would prefer if you didn't." Her words weren't unkind. They were simply stated, like a rule that had always existed, and he had merely forgotten it. Calder reached instinctively for the mirror, adjusting its line of sight higher, so all he could see now was the faint ceiling glow and the ghost-pale suggestion of the road behind. His own reflection disappeared. "Sure," he murmured. "Not a problem." He pulled away from the curb. The navigation app flickered once like a pulse. before repainting the route. Calder watched as the blue line bent off the main streets, sketched itself into side roads he didn't recognize, and finally bled into unlabeled gray areas where there shouldn't have been roads at all. He hesitated, but the car kept moving. Silence settled in like a second passenger. The city fell away within minutes, replaced by stretches of half-lit land, old stone walls, and stands of pine that whispered whenever the wind shifted. Calder listened to the road, to the humming rubber on wet asphalt rhythm that felt, tonight, like the slow exhale of something sleeping. Behind him, the woman whispered. Not words, just the kind of soft murmur mothers use while rocking children in dim rooms, a sound, not a sentence. The bundle shifted faintly in her arms. The fabric brushed against itself with a noise too small for meaning. Calder gripped the wheel a little tighter. He wasn't afraid, but there was an old, instinctive discomfort, like stepping into a chapel alone at night where the air carried memory. Long night? He asked softly, more to fill the void than from curiosity. A pause. Yes, she said. 20 years long. He almost turned, almost broke his promise, but he stared instead at the wet road stretching forward. Headlights revealed the thin veil of mist creeping across the asphalt, rippling like breath. What's your name? He asked. Another pause. Elowin, she said. Elowin Price. He let the syllables roll through his mind. Unusual. Soft. A name that sounded like it belonged in a book, left unread for decades. And you? She asked. Calder Wynn. Thank you for driving tonight, Calder. Something about the gratitude wasn't casual. It felt ceremonial, weighted. The smell of lilies grew stronger the farther they drove. Soon, the road seemed to unravel into unfamiliar shapes. The navigation app displayed nothing now, just the car icon crawling across blank gray. Calder's stomach dipped, a faint sensation of losing altitude even though the road remained flat. Fields appeared pale, waterlogged, and empty, stitched together by low stone fences. The fog thickened in pockets, swallowing the world whole and returning it only in fragments. Branches grazed the roof of the car with feather-light taps, as though the night was reaching down to greet him personally. Behind him, Elowin continued to whisper to whatever or whoever she held. And then, softly, a second scent emerged. Not lilies this time. Powder, soap, baby skin sweetness fading into dust. Calder swallowed. He told himself there were dozens of explanations. He told himself not to think about the mirror. He told himself to keep his eyes forward. Is the drop-off really at Hartwell Cemetery? He asked, his voice almost apologetic. Yes, she said gently. It's the last place still waiting for us. The words lingered. Waiting. He nodded, though she could not see it. The lines in his reflectionless mirror caught the faint glow of passing lights. He thought of how he had never really liked that place, not since he was a child, and his grandmother insisted cemeteries were not homes for the dead, but libraries of unfinished stories. He wondered who had filed Elowin's story away. Minutes or hours seemed to pass. Nighttime often blurred like syrup. The car moved through pockets of silence where even insects refused to sing. Then, off to the right, beyond a curtain of fog, Calder saw the gates, tall iron spears. Paint flaked away into rust, stone pillars leaning inward, as though conspiring, and there, hanging crooked on a chain, the faded sign, Hartwell Cemetery decommissioned. No entry. His chest tightened. The city had sealed it. He remembered the news, but the gates now hung slightly open, just enough for a car to slip through, if it didn't mind the sound of metal scraping paint. He slowed. Elowin, he whispered. Are you sure? Yes, she said softly. He liked it best here, when the wind turned warm, when the birds were quiet. Calder's pulse stuttered once. Who did? He asked, even though the answer was already unfolding in the air between them. Silence. Then, with a tenderness that made the night itself lean closer to listen. My son. The lilies bloomed stronger, overwhelming, swallowing oxygen. And Calder, staring ahead into the fog-filled graveyard road, realized, viscerally, painfully, that the bundle in her arms was far too still, and had been, for a very, very long time. The car rolled forward. The gates closed behind them with a sigh. Gravel whispered beneath the tires as Calder eased the car forward. the faint crunch rising and falling like a distant tide. The path wasn't paved, only a thin stretch of beaten earth winding between crooked headstones and yawning trees whose branches laced together high above like clasped fingers. The mist hung low, pooling between graves, blurring the lines between stone and shadow until everything looked like half-remembered silhouettes. He slowed, almost to a crawl. The headlights spilled across the cemetery in tired strokes of yellow, illuminating names that flickered by too quickly to read, but one or two seemed to linger at the edge of his vision, as if waiting to be recognized. The smell of lilies filled the cabin, thick, cloying, strangely heavy. Calder tried to breathe past it. He focused on the wheel, the dash, the road. Anything but the mirror. Anything but the awareness that behind him sat a young mother with a softness in her voice that grief had never managed to erode, and something else. Something wrapped in silence and white cloth. He swallowed, feeling his tongue dry against the roof of his mouth. "You don't have to be afraid," Elowen said gently, as though she had plucked the thought straight from his chest. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "I'm not afraid," he said, but he didn't believe himself. The car drifted deeper into Hartwell. The iron gates were gone from sight, now swallowed by fog and distance, leaving the place feeling strangely unbounded, as if the world had folded inward, and they now traveled within the center of it. Calder noticed, then, that the navigation app had frozen completely. The car icon sat motionless on a blank screen, no longer even pretending to know where they were. He locked the phone and set it face down. "Do you come here often?" he asked before his mind could stop his mouth. Elowen didn't answer immediately. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was contemplative, weighted with private history. "Only when the air feels soft," she said at last. "Only when the night remembers how to listen." Calder didn't know what to do with that sentence, so he folded it away somewhere quiet inside himself. From the corner of his eye, he saw one of the gravestones passing close to the car. The stone leaned at a tilt, coated in lichen. The engraved letters eroded into near nothingness, and yet, as the headlights traced across its face, Calder felt the distinct sensation that the letters were perfectly legible, as if he could read them not with his eyes, but with some old recognition that lived in his ribs. He didn't try. He kept driving. "Do you have children, Calder?" Elowen asked suddenly. His hands tightened on the wheel. "No," he said, a little too quickly. A pause followed. "Then you can't know," she whispered. "What it's like to carry a silence where a life should be." The bundle shifted again in her arms just slightly, the cloth rustling faintly like dry leaves. Calder's skin prickled. There was something in that sound that reminded him of a crib being rocked without a child in it, the motion going on, out of habit, long after the need had vanished. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't a counselor, or a priest, or anyone with the right words for a wound like that. He was just a driver with a rule not to look in the mirror, so he kept his eyes on the path. They passed beneath a tree whose branches drooped so low they brushed the windshield like skeletal fingers tracing rain lines. Something about the touch, the barely there scrape across the glass, made the back of Calder's neck tighten. That was when he heard it. Not Elowen's whisper, not the rustle of cloth. Something softer, a sound so faint it might have been imagined. A breath, small, shallow, there, then gone. Calder's pulse stumbled. His foot twitched on the accelerator before he forced it still. No. It was the car, the vents, the night wind. He stared harder at the road ahead, willing his imagination back into its cage. "Elowen," he said carefully, "you mentioned your son." Her reply came wrapped in a tenderness that hurt to listen to. "Yes. Where?" "If it's not too forward," he said, voice muted. "May I ask how old he was?" Silence unfurled in the back seat, like a ribbon floating through still air. "New," she whispered. The word was barely sound, more like a memory clothed in breath. Calder nodded slowly, even though she could not see it. The road ahead forked two narrow paths diverging between slanted rows of graves. The left path looked smoother, the right one swallowed by deeper fog. Without knowing why, Calder took the right. The ground dipped slightly. Trees leaned in, The air grew cooler, cool enough that a faint bloom of condensation formed each time he exhaled. The windows fogged at the edges, blurring the world into a watercolor of grays. From behind him came another whisper not directed at him, something soft and rhythmic. The sound of a mother telling a story to someone who cannot answer back. A nursery cadence without the words. Calder swallowed. His mind went back uninvited to the smell. The lilies. He'd smelled them only twice before in his life. Once at his grandmother's funeral, and once years later when he drove a nurse home after her night shift at a hospice. Both times the scent had clung like memory to the air. Refusing to leave, he wondered absurdly whether the scent could soak into the upholstery. Whether tomorrow, in daylight, passengers would ask why his car smelled like every goodbye they'd ever said. "Elowen," he said carefully. "Why the mirror?" Her voice answered, soft but certain. "Some doors only open when you look for them." The meaning rolled over him slowly. He did not ask again. Something shifted then, not in the car, but in the night itself. The darkness ahead seemed to withdraw like a curtain being pulled back to reveal a wider clearing. Graves fanned outward in uneven circles, some marked with marble, others with only small wooden crosses, their white paint peeling like dried skin. In the center stood a stone angel, weathered and cracked, one wing broken at the tip. Moss had claimed her eyes, turning her gaze into something blind and sorrowful. At her feet, tiny markers dotted the ground much smaller than the rest arranged in neat rows. Calder's stomach turned gently, as if rocked by an unseen wave. He slowed the car to a near stop. "We're nearly there," Elowen whispered. He didn't remember telling her where he'd planned to stop. He wasn't sure he ever had a destination in mind. The car had simply followed. The angel loomed larger now, her stone face streaked with years of weather, the broken wing reaching upward like a gesture half finished. The fog curled around her base, gathering in the hollows like breath being held. Calder could feel the weight of the rearview mirror above his line of sight, like an eye that no longer dared to blink. It took effort not to glance at it. Every instinct wanted to confirm that nothing was sitting there but a grieving mother and a bundle of cloth. He knew better. The breath, the smell, the way the air felt heavier in the space behind him, as if a presence, however small, pressed lightly against it. Elowen's voice trembled for the first time. "He used to sleep like this," she whispered, head tucked under my chin, as if the world couldn't find him there. Emotion climbed her voice like ivy up an old wall. Calder felt his throat tighten in response, a sympathy so deep it ached. There was no horror in her words, only love that had nowhere left to go. He stopped the car beside the angel. The engine idled low, steady, mechanical, a heartbeat foreign to the stillness of the cemetery. Calder rested his hands on the wheel a moment longer. He hadn't realized how much he'd been clenching until the tendons in his fingers began to ache. He let go slowly, flexing each finger, breathing out the tension he'd been hoarding. In the back seat, there was movement, small, patient, like someone adjusting how they hold something fragile. "Elowen," he said quietly, "do you want me to wait here?" Her reply came after a long pause, long enough that he began to imagine she had faded entirely into the night. "Yes," she said softly. "Please, don't leave just yet." He nodded, though the gesture was useless. Outside, a breeze stirred, faint and cautious, brushing across the graves and slipping through the trees with a sighing whisper. Somewhere in the darkness, a bird gave a single, uncertain chirp, as if it had woken at the wrong hour and wasn't sure why. Calder stared forward. He did not look in the mirror. Behind him, a door opened with a muted click, then closed again. Careful, almost apologetic. Footsteps crunched on gravel, slow, measured. Elowen's voice drifted back, carrying a lullaby's cadence without its words and another sound beneath it. A second rhythm, a softer tread, lighter than hers, as if someone much smaller walked beside her, keeping perfect step. Calder's breath caught in his chest, suspended there, half-formed, refusing to move. He kept his eyes forward, because some doors only open when you look for them. And tonight, he wasn't sure he wanted to know what waited beyond. For a while, Calder didn't move. The engine's low hum filled the space where his breathing should have been, steady and artificial, like borrowed life. Outside, the night felt older than he was, older than asphalt or iron gates, like something carved from stone and left to watch centuries drift by. He stared into the mist. He told himself not to listen. He listened anyway. Elowen's footsteps faded, then resumed, then stopped again, the uncertain rhythm of someone who had arrived at a place too meaningful to march straight toward. And woven through that fragile cadence was the echo of the lighter tread. Soft, deliberate, always a half beat behind, as though shadowing her without quite touching the ground. Calder closed his eyes. It helped nothing. The scent of lilies thickened, sinking into the fabric of the car, into his jacket, into the quiet seams of his thoughts. The smell was no longer simply present, it felt remembered, as if the night had opened an old drawer and let the air breathe from inside. He shifted slightly in his seat, trying to find comfort where none existed. The mirror sat just above his line of sight, an unlit window he refused to open. It pulsed in his awareness like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. A voice drifted through the fog. Elowen. Not the lullaby cadence anymore, this was speaking. Soft and steady, shaped for ears that had long ago forgotten how to answer. "I didn't know what to bring," she whispered. The words carried on the breeze. "Never needed much. Just warmth. Just me. A pause. I'm sorry about the hospital," she continued, breath catching around the edges of the sentence. It was so loud there. "I don't think you liked it. You never liked sudden noises. They startled you." And then her voice broke gently, not with drama or volume, but with the quiet crack of something that had fractured long ago and never found a way to heal. Calder swallowed as though the grief had settled in his throat. He found himself rolling down the window half an inch, not for air, but because some instinct insisted that grief deserved room to breathe. Cold, damp air slipped inside, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and moss and stone and the faint sweetness of flowers laid down long before tonight. A memory rose uninvited from a place in Calder he rarely visited. The day his grandmother's house was emptied. The slow lifting of photographs from dust-marked shelves, the imprint left behind like a ghost of belonging. His mother had cried without sound, the quiet tears of someone who no longer believed she was entitled to loud sorrow. He realized then that love rarely vanished. It simply ran out of places to go. A faint rustle reached him, cloth shifting, something being lowered. And then, very softly, like a secret, Elowen began to speak again. "You were so small," she murmured. "Smaller than the world ever allowed you to be." No, the wind tugged at the edges of her voice. Calder could almost see her there, not by turning, not by looking, but by letting the mind imagine where grief would choose to kneel. He pictured the angel statue, her cracked wing reaching upward. He imagined Elowen beside it, folding herself carefully around the white-wrapped bundle she had carried through the night. The fabric uncreased, the ground undisturbed, the air listening, and between his bones, something shifted, a quiet ache, like a door unlatched. He didn't mean to open his mouth. The question simply appeared there. "Elowen?" Her reply came as if from a long distance, though she couldn't have been more than a dozen steps away. "Yes? Why? Tonight?" Another pause, the kind of pause in which years could live. "Because the days are longest now," she whispered, "and the nights are kind." One. It took him a second to understand she wasn't making poetry, she was stating fact. This was a night when shadows stretched soft and forgiving, when the world dozed lightly rather than shutting tight. She spoke again, more to the air than to him. "For years I tried to let him go. That's what they tell you to do. Move forward. Keep living. As if grief is a room you can walk out of if you simply try the handle hard enough. Work, friend." She laughed, then the barest breath of sound, brittle at the edges. "But it isn't like that. It's a road you keep driving, long after the map ends." Calder felt those words settle in his chest like stones dropped into deep water. He became aware, suddenly, of his hand hovering inches beneath the mirror. He hadn't meant to lift it. Some part of him, the curious, fearful child that still lived under his adult skin, wanted to know, to see. He closed his hand slowly into a fist and lowered it. Some doors only open when you look for them, and something in him, something old and instinctive, knew that the night wanted him to look. He would not. Instead, he stared forward through the thin slit of fog-creased air, his jaw tight, his breath shallow. A moth drifted lazily across the beam of the headlights, its powder-soft wings flashing ivory before being swallowed by darkness once more. Behind him, Elowen's voice softened further, a near whisper now. "I used to sit beside his crib at night," she said, just listening to him breathe. That tiny sound, it was everything. The world would disappear. There was only that soft rhythm and the thought that as long as it continued, so did I. The wind pressed gently against the car. The roof ticked the faint, metallic sound of cooling. And then one night, she continued. The room was too quiet. Calder shut his eyes. He didn't need more. He understood. There are silences that carry weight. There are silences that change the shape of a life. And there are silences that never end, no matter how many years try to pile themselves on top of them. Elowen exhaled a sound fragile enough to break. "The world moved on," she whispered. "Hospitals emptied. Paperwork ended. Flowers wilted. But the silence stayed. It crawled into my ribs and lived there. And every year, on this night, I find that it gets heavier. As if he is further away. As if his footprints are fading." Her voice steadied not with strength, but with resignation. "So, this year, I thought I would walk him one last time. Show him the places I still remember. Let him rest where the world is quiet and the earth is soft. And when the sun rises," she did not finish the sentence. The lilies filled the car like a tide. Calder found his vision blurring, not with tears, exactly, but with the pressure of empathy building behind his eyes. He wiped at them anyway, more for the ritual of the gesture than for necessity. He realized dimly that the small footfalls had ceased. Only one set remained. Elowen's, slow, careful, returning. The passenger door opened, closed. The car exhaled with her. She did not speak at first. Calder waited, letting the silence serve as offering rather than absence. When her voice came, it was quieter than he had ever heard it. "Thank you for waiting," he nodded, even though the gesture dissolved into the windshield. Of course, there was a long moment in which neither of them moved. The night pressed close. Somewhere beyond the fog, the faintest suggestion of dawn. Not light yet, but the idea of it lingered just beyond the horizon, waiting its turn. Elowen inhaled slowly, and the lilies faded. Not completely, but enough that Calder noticed the difference, as though the scent had seeped gently into the earth rather than lingering trapped in the car. He almost asked where the bundle was now, but the question would have been cruel, so he said nothing. He straightened his shoulders. His hands returned to the wheel, steady now, anchored not by courage, but by simple human decency. "Shall I drive you home?" he asked softly. Elowen hesitated, and in that hesitation, Calder sensed that home was not a place she expected to reach anymore, at least not in the way he meant. "Yes," she said at last, "just until the edge of the city." Her voice carried gratitude folded into sorrow. Something finished, yet unended. Calder nodded once. He didn't check the mirror. The engine's hum deepened as he shifted the car into motion. Gravel crackled beneath the tires once more. The broken wing angel receded into the fog, growing smaller, until she vanished entirely, leaving only the sense that something had been laid down, not forgotten, but allowed to rest. They drove in silence, and for the first time that night, Calder sensed not an approaching darkness, but a departing one. The path out of Hartwell Cemetery felt narrower than the one that had carried them in, as though the night itself was reluctant to release them. The fog gathered more thickly near the ground, curling around the base of the headstones and drifting lazily across the track. Calder guided the car forward with steady hands, the headlights pushing a small tunnel through the gray. Neither of them spoke. There are silences that linger like fog, two silences that belong to the person who has laid something down at last, and the one who has borne witness to the setting down. Calder honored it without fully knowing how. He held the wheel gently, as if the car itself might bruise beneath his grip. The iron gates came into view sooner than he expected, their pointed shadows stretching long and crooked across the damp earth. He wondered, distantly, whether they had always been this close, or whether time bent differently inside Hartwell. He guided the car through the narrow opening. The metal whispered against the paint with a tiny sigh like a ribbon being tugged from a knot, and suddenly the night felt less listening. Elowen shifted slightly in the back seat. Not much, just enough to suggest she had changed the way her hands rested in her lap. Calder noticed how quiet the air had become. No lilies, no soft breath, just the faint cold scent of dew-wet grass and the mechanical murmur of the car. He exhaled slowly, a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The road beyond the cemetery was different now. What had been a maze of unmarked lanes and forgotten tracks seemed to resolve itself into something more ordinary, streetlights appearing at slow intervals, their yellow halos blurring like watercolor through the lingering moisture in the air. The app on his phone revived with a soft glow, the static map flickering back into existence as if it had only been sleeping. He didn't question it. Some things worked again when they were no longer needed. They passed fields, then houses with darkened windows, then the quiet backbone of the city easing back into place around them. The familiar streets, closed diners, bus stops where no one waited at this hour. Calder relaxed by degrees, the night's earlier edge softening into a muted ache. He realized, then, that he hadn't heard Elowen breathe since they'd left the gates. He resisted the urge to look. "How far would you like to go?" he asked instead, his voice low and level. There was a soft sound behind him like fabric brushing against itself, and then her reply, "Just to the river." Her voice was different now, not cold or absent, but lighter, less burdened, as if she had handed something heavy to the earth and it had agreed to keep it. Calder nodded, even though she could not see. He turned onto Mariner Road, the same overpass where he'd first collected her, and followed it down toward the slow-moving black ribbon of water that cut through the city like a quiet scar. The riverbanks were lined with skeletal trees, their branches etched in silver against the faint promise of dawn beginning to loosen along the horizon. He slowed the car. "Here?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said. "Here is fine," to say. He eased the car to a stop beneath a lamp that hummed softly its light, forming a pale circle on the wet pavement, the night thinning at the edges. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world felt suspended as if the river, the trees, the lamp, the car, and the two of them inside it were all holding their breath together. "Thank you, Calder," Elowen said. Her voice wrapped softly around his name, deliberate, sincere, as if it mattered to her that he be acknowledged not as a service, but as a person. "You're welcome," he replied, and meant it more deeply than the words could convey. He waited for the sound of the rear door opening. It didn't come. Instead, there was a pause, a very long one, during which Calder felt something shift inside the car. Not movement, exactly. More like absence rearranging itself. The air grew cooler by a fraction. The faintest echo of lilies stirred not strong enough to smell, only to remember. He realized, then, that he hadn't heard the soft second tread since Hartwell. "Elowen?" he said softly. No answer. He didn't turn. Not yet. He stared at the windshield, where the first faint blush of twilight had begun to soften the sky, thinning the darkness into something pale and honest. The quiet reminded him of early mornings after sleepless nights, when the world feels almost too fragile to touch. He lifted a hand, slow, careful, and rested his fingertips lightly against the base of the rearview mirror. He hesitated. Some doors only open when you look for them, but the night was ending now, and there are some truths that don't come as punishment, but as kindness. He tilted the mirror just enough, not fully, just a breath, just enough to catch the faintest reflection of the back seat, where there should have been the shape of a woman in a slate-gray coat. There was only the dim fabric of the seat, empty, softly indented, as if someone had been there for a very long time, and had only just stood up. Calder's breath fluttered once in his throat. He did not feel fear, only a heaviness, and beneath it, a strange sense of peace, like standing in a church after everyone has gone home, when the echoes of prayer are still warming the air. On the seat beside the faint indentation lay something small, the edges worn soft by years of being held. A folded card, yellowed, fragile at the creases. He didn't reach for it yet. Instead, he let the mirror fall back into place, turning the world forward once more. Outside, the river moved slowly past, carrying the dim reflection of the lamplight along its surface like a drifting coin. A distant gull cried the lonely, searching sound of something waking too early. Calder finally turned, gently, without rushing the night. The back seat was empty. No coat, no pale hands, no white-wrapped bundle, only the faint memory of lilies that had already begun to dissolve. And the card. It lay there as if it had always belonged, patient, unassuming, waiting to be noticed in its own time. Calder reached out and picked it up with careful fingers, afraid the paper might crumble. The edges flaked like old petals. He turned it over slowly. On the front, in faded silver lettering, were the words, "With deepest sympathy." He swallowed. The style was old, the font the kind used in condolence cards long before apps and texts replaced handwriting. A thin line of embossed lilies curled along the border, their white once vivid, now only a ghost of itself. His thumb brushed the crease. He opened the card. Inside, the ink had paled to a soft brown. The handwriting was neat, looping, the kind taught in schools decades ago. "Thank you for taking care of my boy. Elowen Price. 199." The last digit of the year had been smudged into a faint, unreadable blur, as if time itself had dragged a careful thumb across it. Calder stared at the message for a long moment, not shocked, not horrified, only profoundly, quietly aware that he had stepped for a few hours into a grief that had never learned how to rest, a grief that had finally found a place to lay down. He closed the card gently out of respect, not fear, and set it on the passenger seat beside him, as though giving it its own quiet space. Then he looked once more into the mirror, only himself now, eyes tired, face softened by something he didn't yet have the language for. The sky above the river had begun to lighten a watercolor wash of blue and pearl. The night was closing. Whatever doors had opened were sliding shut again, kind and silent, leaving behind nothing but memory and the faint scent of lilies that was already almost gone. Calder rested his hands on the wheel. For the first time in years, he felt as though the road ahead might actually be leading somewhere. He shifted the car into drive, and as the city slowly woke around him, the card lay quiet on the seat, a 20-year-old thank you from someone who had needed one last ride through the dark, before finally learning how to let go. The city never wakes all at once. It stirs. A window glows to life in a distant apartment block. A delivery truck rattles across an empty intersection, its tires hissing over wet asphalt. Somewhere, a door opens and closes, letting out the brief bark of a dog before the sound is swallowed again. These little noises stitched themselves into the thinning dark as Calder guided the car away from the river, the lamplight shrinking in the rear view until it vanished into the pale seam of morning. He drove without the app now. Old habit told him where to go. His hands sat loosely on the wheel, not gripping, simply resting, as if even his bones had grown tired of bracing for things they couldn't name. The card lay on the passenger seat beside him. He didn't look at it often. Just enough that its presence remained real, not imagined, not dreamt. Something that belonged to the physical world. Something weightless and heavy at the same time. The smell of lilies had almost faded. Only the faintest suggestion lingered, the ghost of a ghost-like perfume brushed against a coat long ago. Calder inhaled deeply, expecting to feel relief now that the scent was mostly gone. He didn't. He only felt changed, slightly, quietly, as if the night had left a small fingerprint inside him that would never quite wash away. His shift technically still had hours left. A younger version of himself might have switched the app back on immediately, chasing one more fare, and then another, until exhaustion erased memory. But tonight, or rather, this thin gray morning that still smelled like rain, the idea of taking a stranger into the back seat felt wrong, disrespectful, somehow. The place where grief had sat needed time to cool. So he drove toward the riverfront cafe that opened indecently early, a place where fishermen and sleepless people shared coffee without needing to speak. He parked a little way down the street instead of right outside, letting the engine tick itself quiet. He sat there for a moment, watching the sky dilute from charcoal to pearl. The first smear of color, a shy, hesitant rose, brushed the horizon like a secret being tested. He picked up the card. He opened it again. He read the words as if they might have changed while the sun wasn't looking. "Thank you for taking care of my boy." It was such a small sentence, yet it held the gravity of a lifetime. He traced the smudged final digit of the year with his thumb. The ink had bled there, not from water, he realized now, but from a tear that had dried long before he ever stepped into that car. He closed the card and slipped it carefully into the glove box, not hidden, not discarded. Simply kept. A kindness preserved. Then he got out. The morning air was cool and clean, smelling of river and distant bread, ovens, and the faint, sharp whisper of impending sunlight. Calder stretched slow, careful as though he worried the day might break if he moved too fast. Inside the cafe, the bells above the door chimed softly. The barista, a woman with kind eyes who had seen him on more nights than he could count, gave him a tired smile. "Rough shift?" she asked gently. Calder opened his mouth, closed it, searched for the simplest truth that didn't betray what wasn't his to share. "Long," he said. She nodded the universal language of those who understand, without needing details, and slid him a mug without asking for his order. He wrapped his hands around it, grateful for the warmth, for the way ordinary heat anchored him to a world where the dead did not ride in silence and ask that mirrors be ignored. He took a sip. The coffee was slightly bitter, real. He watched the window as the sky brightened. Cars began to appear, one at a time, like shy animals testing the path. A man jogged past with headphones in, his breath fogging the glass for a heartbeat before vanishing. Life resumed. When his phone buzzed, he expected another ride request by reflex, though he'd never turned the app back on. It wasn't. A notification from the rideshare company. Uncompleted fare review Hartwell Cemetery. Trip data unavailable. Please verify route details. Calder stared at the message. He set the phone down. He didn't touch it for a while. Outside, a thin bar of sunlight finally broke free from the horizon, laying itself across the river like a golden bridge. The world shifted almost imperceptibly into day, and with that change, Calder felt for the first time the presence of the night recede. Not violently, gently, like a tide sliding back over sand, leaving little shells of memory behind. He finished his coffee. He tipped more than usual. When he returned to the car, he sat in the driver's seat with the door still open, letting the new light spill across the dashboard. Dust turned to glitter in the beam. The back seat, ordinary fabric, slightly worn, free of indentations, looked impossibly mundane now, as if it could never have held sorrow or gratitude or the quiet outline of a mother's ghost. And yet, Calder placed his hand on the headrest. A small gesture, a thank you in return. Then he closed the door and turned the key. The engine woke with a familiar purr. He switched on the app not because he needed distraction, but because the world goes on, and so must the things that keep us tethered to it. The first ride appeared within seconds. Pickup, Riverside Apartments, passenger name, Mara Whitley, a normal thought, a living name. He accepted. As the car rolled forward, he glanced briefly habitually into the rearview mirror. Only the morning, only himself, only the road blinking open like an eye that had just learned how to soften. He smiled a small thing, barely there, and let the city gather him back into its unfolding day. Behind him, unseen inside the closed glove box, the sympathy card rested in the dark. A 20-year-old message of thanks that had finally reached its destination while somewhere, wherever sorrow goes when it is finished being lonely, a mother and her child walked together and did not need the road anymore. The pediatric ward's echo. The hospital didn't look haunted from the outside. It just looked tired. A long, low slab of concrete and brick, its windows boarded over in uneven rows like crooked teeth. Kudzu and ivy tangled their way up the walls, swallowing corners and gutters, turning the building into something the earth was slowly reclaiming. A rusted emergency sign still clung to the entrance canopy. ST. Marlowe Children's Medical Center, the letters ghost pale from sun and rain. Rowan Hale stood at the edge of the cracked parking lot, breath fogging gently in the late evening air, backpack slung over one shoulder. He'd filmed abandoned malls, forgotten factories, entire neighborhoods where people had simply moved on. But pediatric hospitals were different. They carried a residue, like laughter stored in the walls that didn't know where to go anymore. He lifted his camera, let the lens drink in the facade, then lowered it again. "All right," he murmured to no one, voice barely above the wind. "Just a building." But even as he said it, he knew that was a lie. He'd read about the fire 15 years ago now. Electrical fault, smoke damage. No children died, the article had insisted. Evacuation successful. Closure due to structural risk. Everything tidy, clean, official. But the locals told a different version. They always did. Rowan found the service entrance hidden behind overgrown shrubs. The padlock was already snapped a clean, deliberate break. Urban explorers rarely confessed to entry routes, but they recognized them like secret handshakes. He slipped inside, The air changed the moment the door closed behind him. Not colder, just heavier. The way libraries feel, except instead of paper and dust, this place smelled faintly of disinfectant that had soaked too deeply into the walls to ever leave. And something else beneath it, softer, like old crayons and plastic toys left in the sun. His flashlight beam sliced through the dark, peeling paint, long corridors, abandoned wheelchairs with cracked vinyl seats, a mural of cartoon animals along the wall, giraffes and elephants and rabbits smiling with chipped enamel eyes. Their colors had faded in patchy bleeds, as though tears of rainwater had run down their faces for years. He walked slowly, not out of fear, not yet, but out of respect. His boots whispered across the linoleum, scuffing dirt into old footprints that had waited too long for new company. He reached the central lobby, once bright, now a fossil of its former warmth. A reception desk slumped in the middle of the space, papers fossilized across its surface, warped into brittle waves. A faded balloon, star-shaped, clung to the ceiling corner, deflated, its ribbon dangling like a withered vine. He filmed in silence for a while, narrating only in his head. He didn't like hearing his voice in places like this. The speaker system lined the ceiling, old white discs with metal grills, ringed with grime. Their wires drooped like veins that had forgotten where they were meant to go. Burn marks still kissed the corners of the room, not raging inferno scars, but smoke ghosts. Gray fingers reaching upward, as though the fire had tried to climb away from itself. A corridor branched off to the right. Pediatric ward rooms. 401, 420. The sign hung crooked. Of course, he went that way. His footsteps echoed softly, the kind of echo that didn't bounce back right. It came back thinner, smaller, like something was listening first before returning the sound. He passed door after door. He slowed. The fourth door was different. The number 404 had been scrubbed away harshly, leaving only the faintest ghost impression of what it once was. The door itself was child-sized, not literally smaller, but somehow more intimate. The faded sticker of a blue kite clung stubbornly near the handle. Rowan lifted his hand, paused. Every instinct said, "Don't." But curiosity is louder than instinct sometimes, especially when the room behind a door has been waiting years to be opened. He pressed. The door gave easily. The room was drowned in half-light, dust motes drifting lazily like tiny suspended planets caught in the flashlight beam. A child-sized bed sat beneath the far window, its metal rails scuffed. A small plastic giraffe still tied to one corner with fraying ribbon. Sunlight had once warmed this room. Now only the memory of it remained. A shelf lined the wall, its contents warped and burned in places. A storybook lay open, its pages curled in a permanent gasp. Crayon drawings were taped crookedly to the wall. Stick figures, bright suns, lopsided hearts. One page had been scribbled over so many times in thick red wax that the paper had nearly torn through. Rowan filmed. He rarely spoke to the camera on site. He saved commentary for editing. But the silence in here felt curated, preserved, like the room had been left as a shrine for something no one wanted to name. He turned toward the old intercom speaker above the bed. White grill, dust-choked, dead technology. That was when it happened. A sound emerged from it, thin, fragile, filtered by distance. The soft, rising giggle of a child. It wasn't loud. It wasn't playful. It was wrong, because it sounded present, live, and the intercom had been disconnected for 15 years. Rowan froze. The laugh repeated, not identical this time. Children don't repeat sounds cleanly. This one bubbled up, carried a breath, cracked on the end like it belonged to lungs. His mouth dried. He told himself it was wind through a pipe, a trick of acoustics, the brain searching for patterns. But he'd heard echoes in empty buildings before. None of them had sounded like this. The laughter faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the vast hush of abandonment behind. Rowan lowered the camera slowly, his hand trembling for the first time that evening. He swallowed. "Okay," he whispered under his breath, like he might startle something. "Okay, that's fine. That's just an old wire grounding, or feedback." But the intercom stayed mute now. Innocent. Blank. A dead mouth pretending it had never spoken. He backed out into the hall. He needed air. He needed distance. His boot kicked something small, sending it skittering across the floor with a soft plastic rattle. He looked down. A candy, individually wrapped, butterscotch, the kind a grandparent might keep in a pocket. It shouldn't have been there. The floor was thick with grime and ash and years of dust, but the wrapper was clean. Almost new. Rowan crouched. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to, because somewhere along the corridor, faint and filtered and carried through the old announcement system like a memory stitched into copper wire, a voice, gentle, tired, older, whispered through the ceiling. Room 404, sweetheart. Only one candy a day. You know the rules. Then silence. So complete, it roared. Rowan straightened slowly, breath shallow, every instinct in his bones telling him what the rational part of his mind refused to accept. He was not alone in the pediatric ward, and the building did not care whether the speaker system still worked. Some echoes. Don't need power. Rowan forced himself to keep moving. Standing still in places like this was worse. Stillness let the mind start building shadows that didn't exist, or worse, gave the ones that did a chance to notice you. So he walked, not far, just down the corridor, boots whispering over grit and dust far enough that room 404 wasn't the only thing in his mind anymore. He needed something solid to ground himself, something rational, paperwork, old signage, a broken vending machine, anything with edges that belonged firmly to the world he knew. The pediatric nurse's station stood like a small island in the middle of the hallway, curved desk, overturned chair, a scattered drift of files fossilized in dust. Rowan shone his flashlight across the counter, his beam catching bits of glass, a cracked novelty mug shaped like a panda, a name badge half buried beneath gray powder. Celeste Arduin RN. The corners of the badge were singed. He swallowed. There was a partially melted plastic container beside it, the kind people filled with wrapped candies at reception desks. The lid had warped, but wedged beneath it, unbelievably, was another piece of butterscotch. Clean, unaged, like it had been placed there yesterday. His skin prickled a sensation like tiny electric insects marching quietly up the back of his neck. He didn't touch the candy. He lifted his camera again, partly for documentation, partly for courage. Framing the world through a lens always made it feel slightly less able to reach him. Behind the desk, a door marked staff only hung ajar. He pushed it with his fingertips. The office inside was small, 2 desks facing opposite walls, a filing cabinet with its drawers yawning open like startled mouths, a corkboard filled with photos and shift announcements yellowed into sepia, smiling nurses, children with tubes taped to their cheeks but grins fierce enough to challenge the world. Birthday decorations, paper crowns. A fire had touched this room too, not enough to devour it, but enough to leave behind the blackened kiss of smoke along the ceiling. The air inside felt different, close, as if it had been holding its breath. Rowan noticed it then. On the desk beneath the corkboard, a portable cassette recorder, old, rectangular, scuffed around the buttons, a cracked blue sticker on the back that read property of St. Marlowe Pediatrics. The built-in microphone had a little foam cap, gone brittle and discolored by age. Next to it sat a cassette tape in a clear plastic case. A strip of masking tape ran along the spine. Someone had written on it in careful block letters, Lark Room 404. The handwriting was neat but weary, the kind that had filled too many forms. Rowan's breath slowed. He told himself the tape wouldn't play. Nothing this old ever worked without coaxing in parts. But the recorder already had batteries inside. He could see them through the vent. He didn't want to press play. He pressed play. There was a click, a soft whir, a hiss of static, long, slow, like breath dragged through teeth. Then, a woman's voice, warm but exhausted, filled the little office. All right. Testing. Is this still recording? Yes. Good. This is Nurse Celeste Arduin. Night shift. Pediatric wing. Date. A small rustle of paper. June 12th. Her sigh ghosted through the speaker. I'm keeping this because sometimes talking out loud helps. And because Lark, a faint smile, lived inside the word. Lark doesn't like silence. Rowan swallowed. His flashlight trembled minutely against the wall. Celeste continued. He's still in 404, eating almost nothing but candy again. I keep telling him he can't live on sugar, that he's gonna float away one day like a balloon if he keeps it up. Her tone softened. He laughs when I say that. He doesn't really talk like other kids. He hums, sings little pieces of things, and sometimes he'll whisper, but only if you're very close. Closer than you should be, really. Another rustle, a distant beep. Monitors, footsteps. Dr. Halvern says it's a trauma response. I say he's just Lark. He won't answer to his real name anymore. Only that. So we all call him Lark now. Rowan could hear the affection. The kind you didn't learn, the kind that just grows. He won't sleep, unless he has a candy in his hand. Says monsters aren't allowed to eat sugar. So if they come, he'll share it, and they'll go away because it will make them sick. A long quiet stretched across the tape. Then Celeste whispered, as if embarrassed by her own confession. Sometimes I leave one on the table when I think he's pretending to sleep, just to make him feel safe. Another pause. A voice drifted faintly into the recorder's range, then high, soft, unmistakably small, singing a string of nonsense syllables. Child song, not quite words. Old as breath. Celeste chuckled a tired, fond sound. Yes, sweetheart, she called gently, further away from the mic now. But only one. You know the rules. The child's humming grew slightly louder, pleased. Rowan forgot to breathe. Static filled the gap. Something clicked. There was a sudden distortion, a warping of sound, like the recorder had been shaken mid-sentence. When Celeste's voice returned, it carried an edge of worry now. He's been asking about the fire drills again. Keeps pointing at the sprinklers and asking if they cry. I don't think he understands why people panic when alarms go off, he said. The tape fluttered, stuttered, then continued like nothing had interrupted it. Sometimes I think the building listens to him. That sentence hung in the stale air like a curtain no one wanted to pull aside. Rowan realized he was standing very still, the kind of stillness that animals adopt when they sense the sky watching. The tape went on. Tonight he refused to sleep without 2 candies, one for him, one for the boy in the ceiling. I asked him what boy. He laughed and said the speakers have mouths. A silence, longer this time. When Celeste spoke again, her voice was lower, almost a whisper. I don't like being on this ward alone anymore. Beezing burst. A room tone bled into the recording, the kind of hush hospitals cultivate at night, where every sound arrives like a trespass. Then, suddenly, a giggle, right beside the microphone. Soft, heart-stoppingly close. Celeste Gasped. Sweetheart, you scared me. Where did you? Static swallowed her words. The tape clicked, stopped. Rowan stared at the recorder as though it might look back at him. He was aware of his heartbeat now, too loud, out of place in the quiet. The building made settling noises, small creaks, distant drips. Somewhere in the vents, something shifted. Air? An animal? Or... He rewound a few seconds, thumb trembling slightly, and played the child's giggle again. This time, it wasn't alone. Underneath it, so faint it almost hid in the static, he heard another sound, the syrupy crinkle of candy wrapper being slowly twisted open. He stopped the tape. The building listened. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't, but belief doesn't matter. In places stitched together with memory and ash. He turned toward the office doorway, toward the corridor, and the crooked sign pointing toward 401, 420. And for the briefest moment, before his mind had time to armor itself with reason, he thought he saw movement at the far end of the hall. Not a shape, just the subtle shift of shadow, the kind that might be made by something very small, stepping just out of sight. His mouth tasted of copper. He forced himself to speak because silence had begun to feel like permission. I'm just looking around, he said softly, voice barely chosen from the air. I'm not here to take anything. The floor answered him with a lonely creak. The intercom overhead crackled. For a heartbeat, Rowan heard nothing. Then, just for a moment, the faintest whisper of a child, blurred by distance and wire. Candy? The word didn't sound hungry, just hopeful, like a ritual. Like a rule the ward had lived by for longer than time could measure. Rowan closed his eyes. Urban exploration was meant to be about architecture, history, decay, beauty and abandonment. Not this. Not this. He swallowed. I don't have any, he whispered. Silence followed, thin and stretched. Then, shamefully, absurdly, Rowan dug into his backpack anyway. Old habit. Road snacks. A bag of caramel candy he'd half forgot existed. He stared at it in his hand, bright gold, harmless. A little ordinary piece of sugar meant to keep long drives awake. He looked down the corridor toward room 404. The air felt like it was waiting, and he realized with the slow dread of someone stepping willingly over a line that he was going to take the candy there. Because logic was useless now. Because fear felt rude. Because somewhere in the bones of this abandoned ward lived a child who believed that as long as there was candy, the monsters would stay away. And Rowan Hale, amateur explorer, skeptic, rationalist, didn't want to be the one to teach the dark a different rule. The hallway didn't seem longer on the way back, just quieter. Rowan walked slowly, the small, wrapped caramel pressing lightly into the sweat-damp center of his palm. It felt absurd to be this careful with something so ordinary: sugar, syrup, a bit of waxed paper, and yet the candy seemed to hum with a meaning it had never been designed to hold. He passed room 401. The battered blue kite sticker beside the last door came into view, peeling, its edges curled like tired fingers. Sibylingsa. He hesitated at the threshold. The room hadn't changed. Dust still floated in lazy constellations. The little giraffe still dangled from the bed rail by its faded ribbon. Crayon suns still beamed their cracked smiles from the wall as if no one had told them the building had burned. That the children had gone. That the world had moved on without their permission. Only the air felt different, more attentive, like the room had turned its head to watch him come back. Rowan stepped inside. He was careful not to disturb anything that hadn't already surrendered to time. His footsteps barely whispered. The floor creaked only once, and even that sound felt guilty. He stopped beside the small bedside table. The top was scarred with tiny scratches, the kind left by restless little hands dragging toys back and forth, for hours that measured pain by inches. The faint outline of a missing coaster remained as a pale circle in the dust. Rowan stared at the table for a long moment. He wasn't sure what the right way to do this was. Rituals matter even when you don't believe in what they serve. So he crouched slightly, lowering himself to the height of someone small, and set the caramel gently onto the table, right where a child might see it first thing upon waking. He withdrew his hand slowly. The wrapper caught the flashlight's beam and gleamed cheerful gold in a room drained of color. Rowan swallowed. "I left this for you," he whispered. The last word felt strange in his mouth. You. Like the room contained an audience. The silence that followed was deep, not empty, but charged, like the air before a summer storm breaks. Then, the intercom above the bed gave a soft, stuttering crackle. Not loud, not dramatic, just a tired piece of old hardware remembering it once had a voice. A breath not static, not wind, but something that sounded, lived, ghosted through the grill. Then a faint, delighted sound. A giggle, high, light, unmistakable. It was followed by the slowest crinkle Rowan had ever heard. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't dare. The candy lay on the table untouched, but the wrapper began to stir. Not jump, not jerk. Stir. As though unseen fingertips were brushing the edges, testing them, exploring the seams the way small, uncertain hands do when they haven't quite mastered dexterity. The wrapper twisted. Tiny plastic whined softly under pressure. The candy rolled half a centimeter. Rowan's throat locked. He watched, truly watched, as the caramel's gold skin peeled back millimeter by patient millimeter. There was nothing visible above the table. No shape, no shimmer, no distortion in the air. But the candy was being unwrapped, not snatched, not eaten greedily, just carefully, methodically, like a child told to make something last. The room seemed to lean closer with every second. The last curl of wrapper loosened with a faint sigh. The caramel bear now gleamed softly in the flashlight's glow, its surface glistening like amber cotton resin. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the intercom crackled again. A tiny sound, tuneless. Childlike drifted through it. A fragment of song without shape. The microphone had not existed to record this. The system was dead, but the sound came anyway. It sounded happy, relieved, safe. Rowan found tears pricking the corners of his eyes, not out of terror, not even fully out of sorrow, but out of some deeper ache, the kind that comes from brushing against loneliness that never should have existed in the first place. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the soft room. "You're welcome," he said, voice unsteady. For a moment, he felt ridiculous. Then a reply came, so faint he almost missed it. "Thank you," barely formed, barely there, but it lived. A rustle of movement, not in the bed, not in the air, but in the space of the room itself, drifted past him, like the feeling of someone small slipping by your leg, careful not to bump you. The giraffe toy on the bed rail swayed ever so slightly. Not from wind. There was no wind, just motion, presence. Rowan stepped back on instinct, not out of fear, but out of respect, giving the room space, letting it be a room again, not a museum display case. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of dust settling. Then the intercom clicked softly once, twice, like a child tapping a microphone in curiosity. And the first phrase of a lullaby, tuneless but earnest, floated through the speaker. A tune so simple it may never have had a name. Rowan closed his eyes. He didn't want to see. He wanted to listen, because there are some things that live only in the listening. The song faded. Silence returned, but it felt different now. Not empty. Filled. Like a belly after a long hunger. Rowan opened his eyes again. The caramel candy was gone. Not crumbled. Not dropped. Just gone. Only the empty wrapper remained on the table, flattened, as though a small, patient hand had smoothed it out carefully to keep. A soft voice floated once more from the ceiling, barely more than breath. One a day. A rule. A riddle. A promise. And beneath the words, not threatening. Not pleading, just hopeful. Tomorrow? Rowan's chest tightened. He didn't answer right away, because he understood painfully what the question meant. The ward was still waiting, still keeping the rules, still counting the days by sugar, still hoping that someone would come back to make sure the monsters, whatever they were, never crossed the boundary of a small boy's logic. He swallowed past the ache. "I don't live here," he whispered honestly. "But I'll try." He wasn't sure what part of him meant it. Maybe all of him. The intercom let out a tiny sigh, a soft exhale that could have been static and felt quiet. The room exhaled with it. Rowan stood there for a long moment, letting the reality of what he'd seen settle into the quiet folds of his mind. He knew what skeptics would say. He knew what he would have said. Once. But the wrapper crinkled against the tabletop. Real as gravity. And sometimes reality is kinder than belief. He turned to leave. At the doorway, something made him pause. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement. Just a feeling. A gentle, grateful weight resting for the briefest second against his hand, like the smallest of thank yous. Then it was gone. Rowan stepped back into the hallway. The pediatric ward had never looked more empty, and never felt more full. Rowan didn't go far. He told himself he would, that he'd step back into the main hallway, take a steadying breath, maybe get a shot of the stairwell or the burned-out cafeteria. Something normal, something architectural, with hard edges and no ghosts hiding between syllables. But the ward wouldn't quite release him. The air still felt attentive, listening, but not unkind. He stopped at the nurse's station again, hand-brushing the warped countertop. The panda mug stared up at him with cartoon eyes, cracked right through the middle. The soft plastic lid of the candy container melted. Distorted, now felt impossibly symbolic, as though this place had been holding on to sugar the way the living cling to faith. His gaze drifted back to the staff-only door, to the recorder, to the tape. He hadn't heard the whole thing, and unfinished stories itch. He stepped back into the office, the floor sighing beneath his boots as though grateful to feel weight again. The recorder waited on the desk where he'd left it mute, patient, its little red light a dead eye. The cassette inside was still wound forward, as if stuck mid-thought. Dust shimmered in the beam of his flashlight, settling on the device in a delicate film as if time itself had been tucking it in. He pressed play. The machine resisted for a heartbeat, then relented with a soft mechanical whir. Static washed across the room like a weak tide. Celeste's voice returned closer now, wearier. "I don't know who else to talk to," she murmured. "The senior staff won't listen. They pat my shoulder and say I'm overtired. Maybe I am. But the night doesn't lie. The soft scrape of chair legs across tile. He doesn't sleep unless I'm here. Lark, I mean. He stares at the ceiling and whispers to the speakers. Says they talk back. Says they laugh with him. That they like candy, too. Her voice trembled. I've started leaving a piece on the table every night. Just one. I tell myself it's harmless. Just a little comfort. But this morning the wrapper was folded, perfectly flat. Like small fingers had smoothed every crease. Like someone wanted to make sure they left things neat. She exhaled, not quite fear, not quite awe. And I found one under the nurse's station, too. Like someone was making a collection. Paper shuffled on the tape, a brittle sound. The fire alarms keep malfunctioning. Twice this week. Once during visiting hours. Once at 3 a.m. Lark didn't panic. He just held onto his candy and hummed. Some of the staff joked that maybe he controls the building now. I laughed with them. A pause. I don't laugh anymore. The tape hissed a seam of white noise that felt like a held breath. Then sharper now Celeste's voice. Tonight he asked me what burning sounds like. Rowan's chest tightened. He could almost see the room, the dim fluorescent hum, the cracked paint, the plastic animals fixed in cheerful smiles, and a boy not much more than a shadow under thin blankets holding candy in his fist like a talisman. Celeste went on, but slower now, as though choosing her words was a fragile act. I told him it sounds like rain turning angry, like paper screaming. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then, he said the speakers would keep him safe, that they told him so. The office creaked, not on the tape. Around Rowan, the building owned bones responding to old memories being disturbed. He stayed very still. The tape continued, but the sound quality shifted, warping slightly as if the machine itself remembered too vividly. Smoke in the east wing. They're saying it's small, contained, but the alarms. There was shouting in the background now, running steps, a child crying, another voice cutting in male, urgent, half muted by distance. Get the oxygen. The recorder banged sharply, as though grabbed and moved. Celeste's voice, suddenly too close, flooded the speaker. Lark, listen to me. You need to hold my hand now. We're going for a walk. Just a little walk. You like walks, remember? The child didn't speak, but he hummed, a trembling little thread of sound. Metal clanged somewhere. Another alarm wailed distant, distorted the sound, bending around static like heat around a mirage. Celeste spoke again, breathless. They said the stairwell's blocked. Checking the north corridor. Sweetheart, keep your feet close to mine. Yes, just like that. Rowan's throat burned with a pressure he hadn't expected. He'd never met this nurse. He didn't need to. He understood her. The tape juddered, then jumped, as if a chunk of time had been cleanly cut away. When it resumed, her voice had changed. Not panicked. Worse. Resigned. Smoke's everywhere now. She whispered. We're in 404. I didn't mean to come back here. My body just brought us. The speakers keep crackling. He thinks they're laughing with him. I don't know if I should be grateful or terrified. A short, shaky laugh. He asked me if monsters can still find you in the smoke. I told him no. I told him nothing bad can happen if he stays right here and keeps hold of his candy. Silence. Only the low, grainy rumble of fire breathing on the other side of the walls. I wish that were true. The next sound was unmistakable. The slow crinkle of a candy wrapper. Not from the tape mechanism. From the room then. Then Celeste's whisper, raw. Close. Full of a love too fierce for sense. You keep that, sweetheart. Monsters hate sugar. You said so. See? I remembered. Something popped in the distance, a ceiling tile falling, a fixture bursting. A child's giggle, soft, trusting, brushed the audio like a feather. Good, Celeste whispered, voice breaking. Good boy. We'll stay right here and be very brave together, okay? Just until help comes. A pause. Just until... The tape shrieked with a sudden distortion, a violent rip of sound, then snapped into static so dense it swallowed everything. The recorder clicked. Stopped. Rowan didn't realize he had braced his free hand against the desk until the edge bit into his palm. He stood there, surrounded by dust and 15-year-old air, heart heavy with a story that had never made it into the official incident reports. No children died. That was the headline. But headlines don't measure how long a child's trust lingers in the walls, or how a nurse might stay to keep a promise she made to a frightened boy who believed candy could hold back monsters. The intercom overhead gave a faint, sympathetic crackle. Not a laugh, not a voice, just recognition. Rowan swallowed hard. He wanted to leave. He could leave, but leaving felt wrong, the way walking away from someone mid-sentence feels wrong. He stepped back into the hallway. It was quieter now than before, not empty, but settled, as though telling the story had worn the building out in a gentle way. "Celeste," he whispered without thinking. The name felt fragile in the air. No answer, just the distant drip of old pipes and the soft exhale of air moving through places that no longer remembered why they were built. He turned slowly toward room 404 one last time. The doorway waited, blue kite sticker peeling, paint blistered, metal frame scarred. Inside, the empty wrapper still lay smoothed on the bedside table. Only that, but he didn't mistake the silence this time. It wasn't a void. It was companionship, an empty bed that wasn't lonely, a rule that had been kept for 15 years, a promise still breathing. Rowan exhaled. "Thank you," he said softly, not sure whether he meant the nurse, the child, or the building itself. Maybe all three. For a second, just a second, he thought he heard that little hum again. Content. Safe. Then it faded into memory. He made his way toward the stairwell. The corridor no longer felt watchful, only grateful. And like any place where children had once laughed, it somehow felt a little less abandoned now. The stairs creaked under Rowan's boots, as though they hadn't borne weight in years. Dust puffed lazily into the air with each step, catching in his throat, carrying the faint ghosts of antiseptic and old paper. The deeper he breathed, the more he felt like he was inhaling the residue of lullabies and whispered reassurances, as if the building itself had been a parent once, and now had nothing left to comfort but echoes. He reached the ground floor. Light from the boarded windows spilled in, as thin slices, pale ribbons that divided the hallway into long stepping stones of glow and shadow. Paint blistered along the baseboards. A forgotten wheelchair cast a skeletal shape on the wall. Somewhere far off, a warped door tapped intermittently in the draft like a finger against glass. He paused at the edge of the lobby, turned, looked back down the pediatric corridor, the crooked sign pointing to 401, 420, the darkness pooling around its edges like a soft blanket. He expected fear. What he felt instead was a weight, a tender one, like a hand resting on his shoulder, not holding him back, not begging, just saying goodbye. He lifted his camera, almost as an apology, filmed the hallway's length one last time, the stillness, the soft descent of dust, the weary grace of a place that never meant to become a monument. He whispered, "Thank you for trusting me." His voice came back to him thinner, stretched by the air, not mocked, not mimicked, simply returned. He stepped outside. The change was immediate. The air out here was younger, moving, restless. The world, even in its emptiest corner, still had errands to run. Traffic hummed somewhere in the distance, a low murmur of living breath. A bird took off from the roof with a startled flutter, tracing a crooked line through the sky. Rowan blinked against daylight he hadn't expected yet. The sky was a dull pewter, the sun hiding behind cloud cover as though it wasn't quite ready to meet the day. His lungs filled easier now, but he found himself missing the faint sweetness of old candy. He walked back to the cracked parking lot, gravel crunching softly beneath him. His car sat where he left it, streaked with dust, unbothered by history. Before he opened the door, he stopped. His hand hovered over the handle. Something nagged at him, a small, human urge to check. To be sure. To anchor what he'd witnessed to something that would obey the ordinary rules of time. He turned slowly, looked back at the hospital. It didn't loom, didn't threaten. It simply stood there, heavy with years and stories no one had signed off on. A place meant for healing that had ended up holding on to the very thing it couldn't cure. He almost left it at that. Almost, but his throat tightened around a thought. And before he could stop himself, he reached into his backpack. Another caramel. He weighed it in his palm. Then, feeling foolish and solemn all at once, he crossed back to the entrance. He didn't go in. He just placed the candy gently on the concrete lip of the doorway, where rain would kiss it but the wind might not steal it. He rested his fingertips on the wrapper, A moment the tiniest benediction, then withdrew. "There," he murmured, "one a day." The words felt right, not because the dead need candy, but because children in any world deserve consistency. He stood there for a while, long enough that the silence between him and the entrance began to feel companionable. Long enough that, he thought, just for half a heartbeat, he heard a soft, pleased hum drift faintly from the vents above the door. Not loud, not eerie, just content. He left then. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He simply walked quietly, respectfully back into the living world. No, Iofel. That night, long after he'd returned home and rinsed the dust from his skin and laid his camera gently on the table, Rowan sat on the edge of his bed and listened to the city beyond his window. Traffic, footsteps, snatches of laughter rising up from the street like tiny lanterns. He thought of room 404, of the smooth wrapper left like a paper petal on the table, of the way the candy had unwrapped itself carefully, as if manners still mattered even when the world forgot you. He thought of Nurse Celeste's voice thinning into static, holding a terrified boy's hand and telling him that monsters hate sugar because she didn't know what else to give him except a rule he could live inside. And he thought of the building, how it had listened for 15 years, how it had waited, how it had kept the rule like a bedtime prayer. He reached absently into his coat pocket and felt the edge of something smooth. He frowned, pulled it out. A tiny square of caramel wrapper lay folded there, perfectly flat, the corners pressed with deliberate care. He hadn't put it there. He knew he hadn't. But there it was, quiet, polite, grateful. Rowan sat very still. Then, slowly, reverently, he placed the wrapper on his nightstand. He didn't throw it away. He didn't question it. He just let it stay. Because some echoes aren't meant to be chased out of our lives. Some echoes are meant to be kept not as hauntings, but as reminders that someone once needed kindness badly enough that the world bent a little to give it to them. He turned off the light. Sleep came easier than he expected. And somewhere in a pediatric ward that no longer exists on any working map, a small boy hummed at the ceiling speakers and unwrapped a piece of candy. Very, very carefully, while a tired nurse smiled through the years and kept her promise, because as long as there was one candy a day, the monsters, whatever they were, would always stay away. The hunter's dead. Silas Mercer had always said the Appalachian woods didn't hate you. They just didn't care whether you came back out again. Fog threaded low through the trees that evening, not a blanket, but a thin, drifting lace that curled around roots and boots alike, softening the forest floor into something that felt older than bone. The ridgelines disappeared into a washed-out sky, blue draining into slate, shadows pooling in the ravines until they deepened into something that felt almost liquid. Silas hiked alone. He preferred it that way. When the wind shifted, the forest spoke not with words, but in the way branches tapped and leaves hissed and something unseen scuffed against deadfall. You learned to listen without panicking. You learned not to assume that every crack was a bear or a trespasser or the past trying to catch up. But today the quiet wasn't neutral. Today it felt like the woods were waiting. His radio crackled now and then with the thin voice of dispatch back in town. Weather alerts, trail closures, a mention of a missing hiker 2 counties over, but here under the canopy, the signal came and went like breath. He checked in anyway. Habit. Ritual. You keep the little rules, or the big ones start breaking too. Down in the hollow, the ground grew damp black earth, dense moss gripping stone like old hands. He followed a game trail he didn't fully remember marking. The map in his head, the one every ranger builds without realizing it, stuttered for a moment. This shouldn't be here, he thought, which was strange enough. But the smell was stranger. Not rot, not death, just iron. Old rain rust. The metallic tang of a forgotten place. Silas slowed. Branches snagged his sleeves like they didn't quite want him passing through. He pushed them aside respectfully and stepped into a small clearing carved into the slope like a shallow wound. And there it was, the door, or hatch, really, half buried in the earth, moss creeping along its edges, hinges corroded into brackish sculptures of themselves, thick oak planks bound with iron bands. A chain snapped years ago lay coiled nearby like a dead snake. No signage, no markers, nothing to explain why a man-made hole in the world had gone to such effort to make itself forgotten. Silas stood very still. He could feel the forest behind him now, not pressing, Not looming, just watching. "All right," he muttered, voice low, the way folks talk to dogs and ghosts. "Let's see what you are." The hatch protested when he pulled a deep, wet groan like something long asleep rolling over in its bed, then gave way with a sudden lurch of earth. Cool air breathed out damp, cave stale, with an undercurrent that made his teeth ache. He angled his flashlight down. Stone steps, descending, the kind of steps built by hands that didn't plan to leave often. He hesitated just long enough to remember the checklist he should follow: notify dispatch, wait for backup, don't enter unknown structures alone, and then he went anyway. Because the woods write their own rules, and sometimes the rules write you. The light followed him down. The air thickened. The forest sounds faded, replaced by the close, soft hush of underground space. At the bottom, the steps opened into a low chamber carved directly from the hillside. Dirt walls, timber beams darkened with decades of oil and sweat. And everywhere, traps, bear traps, dozens of them, maybe more. Their jaws gaped open like patient mouths. Serrated teeth stained the reddish brown of old dried blood. Some had chains attached. Some were piled into rusted drifts in the corners. All of them felt used. Silas's stomach tightened. No carcasses. No bones. No fur. Just residue. Just evidence of hurt without witness. He moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything. His flashlight traced arcs across iron teeth and dark stains, dragging shadows along with it. That was when he heard it. A sound from deeper in the dark. Not loud, not threatening, just the gentle, steady shh of metal against stone, like a blade being sharpened. Silas turned. His light found the figure sitting at the far end of the chamber, half in shadow, as still as the walls around him. An old man, or perhaps just a man the years had stopped bothering to count, hat brim shadowing his face, coat worn to softness. Hands slow and methodical as they guided a long hunting knife along the edge of a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape as calm as the tide. He didn't look up right away, didn't startle, didn't ask what Silas was doing trespassing in a grave full of metal teeth. He simply spoke. His voice was low, steady, sanded down by time and solitude, until it had the texture of bark. "Forrest sends you," he said. Not a question. Silas's mouth went dry. "No," he replied automatically. I'm with the service. Ranger Division out of Briar's Gap. This area isn't registered. You're not supposed to." The man chuckled softly, not amused, not unkind. "Forests don't give a damn what's registered." He lifted his head then. The light fell across his face. It didn't make him monstrous. It made him old, weather-carved, deep-cut lines around the mouth, eyes the color of creek stone. Not empty, not angry, just tired, like someone who had been awake for far too many seasons. Silas lowered the beam a little so he wasn't blinding him. "What is this place?" he asked. The man didn't answer. He ran the blade over the stone again. Shh. Then he said, quietly, "Dead house." The word lodged under Silas's ribs like a splinter. "Sir, I'm gonna have to ask you to come topside with me," Silas said, keeping his voice level. "This is an unsafe structure. And those traps, they're illegal to set in these woods. I don't know if you're storing them for disposal or..." "They ain't stored," the man said. He finally set the knife aside, rested his hands scarred, steady on his knees. "They're counted." "Yes, or..." A silence pooled between them. Silas swallowed. "Counted for what?" The man tilted his head, listening. But not to Silas. To the earth. To the beams. To the long memory of roots. "Forrest keeps ledger," he murmured. "Always has. You take too much. You don't speak right to the bones of the place. One day, it looks at what you owe and says, 'Stay a while. Pay it down.'" He looked back at Silas then. There was no malice in his eyes, only recognition. "You smell like someone who knows that." Silas felt something cold slip into his chest, not shock, not fear, just the sense of being seen too clearly in a place that had no business knowing your name. "I don't know what you mean," he said too fast. The man smiled, slow, sad. "Sure you do." He leaned back against the wall as if the earth itself was propping him up. "Been waiting on you?" The knife gleamed beside him. The traps watched with 1,000 iron teeth. And overhead, the Appalachian forest breathed in quiet, ancient rhythm, the kind of rhythm a man could mistake for peace, right up until the moment he realized it was counting. Silas had dealt with every kind of backcountry stubbornness, hermits, poachers, sovereign citizen types with pamphlets and handguns and too much faith in both, but this wasn't that. The man wasn't posturing. He wasn't defiant. He just looked rooted, like pulling him out of this room would rip the hillside open with him. Silas cleared his throat. "What's your name, sir?" The man looked at him for a long, measuring second, the way a deer studies the tree line before deciding whether to step out. Then he said, "Orrin, a beat. Orrin Ketteridge." The name landed heavy. Silas didn't react outwardly. Years of uniform work had trained him well, but something old and half-remembered stirred in the back of his mind. He'd heard that name. Not in the office. Not in briefings. At the diner, pinned above the coffee machine, a yellowing flyer. Corners curled. Black and white photo faded to gray fog. Missing. Orrin Ketteridge. 1,978. Last seen near Black Elk Hollow. Silas's tongue felt too big in his mouth. He kept his voice even. "You're saying you've been down here since?" "Forests don't reckon time the way clockmen do," Orrin said mildly. "Your calendars don't mean much past the third ridge." "No, sir." He picked up the knife again, drew it along the stone with patient care. "Here I came down that hatch," he went on. "They were still building that ugly gas station up in Briar's Gap. My wife hated it. Said it looked like a lunchbox left out in the rain." Silas felt the room tilt. He glanced around at the traps, at the blood-stained teeth, at the low beam sweating slow droplets of water from the rock above. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why stay?" Orrin's smile didn't reach his eyes, didn't start as stay-in. He looked past Silas as if the door of memory was somewhere behind him. Started as hunting. Silas waited. In the woods, silence is a kind of courtesy. You let it make space. Orrin spoke again, the words worn smooth by the number of times he turned them over inside his mouth. "Back then, you hunted because you could. Because the mountain was full up with life and you figured it'd always be there. Bears, elk, more deer than God could count. We took. Sold pelts, filled freezers, didn't ask the place if it minded." He tapped one of the bear traps with the toe of his boot, gentle, like greeting an old dog. "Got good at it. Too good. Folks in town said I had the forest's ear. Truth was, I just stopped hearing it say no." He felt quiet for a beat. When the ledger tipped, I didn't notice. You never do till the numbers come due. Silas swallowed. "What happened?" Orrin looked up then, and for the first time, something flickered behind his eyes that wasn't just tiredness. It was awe. "Forrest called me," he said simply. Not with words, with quiet. Every ridge empty, every valley still. Tracks that went nowhere. Trails that bent me back to where I started, no matter how I swore I'd changed course. He laughed, a small, breathless sound. "You don't fight that. You just follow." Or he knows. Silas thought of times he'd felt that same wrongness. A subtle tilt in the world. Compass needles flirting with madness. The sense of walking through a memory instead of a place. He said nothing. Orrin nodded, as if he could see the admission in the silence. "Found this hatch, same as you. All these traps laid out like a sermon. I thought it was a poacher's den. Came down to set it right. And the door." He jerked his chin toward the stairs. Closed on its own. Winkor. Silas felt the fine hairs rise along his forearms. "You tried to get out," he said. "Course. And?" Orrin's gaze drifted to the ceiling, to the thick quilt of earth and roots above them. Forrest said, "Not yet." The trap teeth glimmered. The air seemed to tighten just a shade, like a belt drawn one notch closer. Silas forced reason into his tone. "You're saying you've been trapped here for 40+ years? Alive? Fed? Breathing? How? Who brings you supplies?" Orrin looked almost apologetic. "I don't starve." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The woods provide for what they keep, whether that's comfort or hunger or whatever strange in-between feeds stories. Silas took a slow breath. The air tasted like pennies and rain rot. He thought of searches long since called off, of wives who remarried or didn't, of children who told their own kids about the hunter the forest borrowed and never returned. He thought, too, of all the traps. Countless mouths of iron apologies stacked in neat, rusting rows. So, the debt, Silas said softly. You owed the woods. Orrin's voice turned almost gentle. Everyone owes the woods. Those folks pay as they go. I ran a tab. He looked at Silas, then truly looked. And now the ledger's still hungry. Silas felt it then, something enormous and patient, moving in the space between seconds. Not a being. Not a god. Just balance. A scale tilted slightly, waiting to be righted. I don't understand why I'm here, he said. Honest. Bear. Orrin set the knife aside carefully, like a man laying down confession. Forest sends replacements same way it sends storms, he said, without asking permission. Only question is, do you hear the asking? Silas swallowed against a throat gone dry. I didn't agree to anything. Orrin's smile turned sorrow tender. Debt don't need your signature. The whetstone sat silent now. Up above, the mountain breathed. Then Silas Mercer, ranger, rule keeper, man of maps, felt for the first time in his life like the land had drawn a circle around him, and stepped inside. Silas had never been claustrophobic. He'd crawled into culverts after trapped dogs, squeezed through root-webbed caves after lost teenagers, and slept inside fire shelters under skies so red they glowed like open wounds, and never once felt the walls closing in. But this place didn't press. It waited. That was worse. He shifted his weight, boots whispering over packed dirt. The bear traps ringed the chamber like a council, each jaw a steel crescent crusted with reddish memory. The stink of old blood wasn't sharp anymore. Time had dulled it into something almost sweet. Orrin leaned forward again, slow, patient, and tested the knife's edge with the pad of his thumb. Force don't rush, he said softly. Not unless you force its hand. It does things at the speed of bark growing over a bullet. Silas exhaled through his nose. You talk like it's alive. Orrin shrugged. A small, worn gesture. Alive ain't the word. Alive means it could die. This? He tapped the floor with a fingertip, dirt streaking his skin. This just is. We're the part that comes and goes. Silas wanted to argue, to say, no, it's weather and biology, and you're an old man who's been alone too long, and grief will make logic put on a costume, but every word withered in his throat, because the longer he stood there, the more he felt it too, that presence without face, that awareness that came not from eyes but from weight. The whole mountain sat above them like a sleeping animal that could crush them without waking. He swallowed. Why traps? He asked. Why keep them here? Why keep count? Orrin's gaze softened, not with fondness, with shame, because every tooth here's a promise, he said. Not the kind you mean to make, just the kind you don't unmake after. He lifted one of the traps beside him, careful, tender as if handling a baby bird. The chain rattled softly. The metal jaws gaped like patience. Every time one of these shut on something that didn't know the rules, that ledger wrote a line. I didn't see it then. All I saw was meat and money and the kind of pride that makes a man bigger than his own skin. He let the trap settle back to the dirt. Force don't care what you say you believe. It cares what your hands do. Silas glanced around. How many? Orrin's eyes drifted over the iron crowd. Enough that the woods got tired of waiting on my conscience. The quiet between them thickened. Not silence, but accumulation. Silas shifted again. Something small inside him, some instinct honed over years of walking tree-dark miles alone, whispered that he should start heading for the stairs. Now, before the waiting finished becoming choosing. But his feet didn't move. Instead, he heard himself ask, "What does it want me for?" Orrin studied him for a long moment. Eyes the pale gray of creekstone under cloud. "You listen," he said simply. "You don't talk over the place. You don't pretend the trail's yours when you're the one borrowed. That's not a debt," Silas murmured. "That's a job." Orrin smiled faintly. "Not the kind you clock out of." His gaze slid toward the dark mouth of the stairs. Force gets tired of holding one man forever. Ledger keeps compounding. so it looks for someone who already carries the woods like a second spine. Someone who won't fight too hard when the door closes. Silas felt the words pass through him like cold water. "I'm not staying." He said it calmly, not defiant, just naming the shape of the world as he'd always known it. "Course you ain't," Orrin replied gently. That's the first thing every man says when the mountain taps his shoulder. He leaned his head back against the dirt wall, closing his eyes for a moment, not in prayer, but in bone-deep fatigue. When it kept me, I fought like hell, scraped my hands raw on that hatch, screamed myself bloody. Took me 2 days to realize there wasn't any sound going up, just down. He opened his eyes again. I only stopped when I heard the first step. Silas blinked. What step? Orrin's jaw tightened, the first real tension Silas had seen in the man. "The one the forest saves for last," he whispered. "Boot, barefoot, paw don't matter. You hear something come down those stairs that ain't you, and you know you ain't alone in the ledger anymore. That there's room for two." He paused, or one replacing the other. Something subtle shifted in the chamber, as if the dirt had taken a deeper breath. Silas's skin prickled. "You're saying..." "I'm saying the woods don't need me forever," Orrin said softly. "Just long enough that the math don't ache so bad. And if it finds some poor bastard who already belongs to the trees, well..." His eyes held Silas's. "It might ask him to spell me." The air grew still. Not dramatic. Not dangerous. Just expectant. Silas became aware of his heartbeat, of the scrape of fabric against his ribs, of the way dust traced lazy spirals through his flashlight beam. The world had narrowed to metal teeth, an old man, and a staircase leading up into trees that no longer felt wholly like trees. He forced steadiness into his voice. "I didn't agree to pay your debt." Orrin nodded. "That's the trick of a ledger. You don't always recognize the signature." Silas swallowed. His mind reached instinctively for reason. "You're dehydrated, malnourished. You've been alone for years. I'm gonna call this in. We'll get you out. We'll..." The radio on his shoulder crackled. Once, twice, then died. No carrier tone. No static. Nothing. Like the forest had pinched the cord between worlds. The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it noticed him. He resisted the urge to look at the stairs. He resisted the urge harder to listen. Orrin spoke again, very quietly now. "You don't have to take my place, Silas. Woods ain't cruel. It's patient. Just don't pretend you don't hear the asking. That's the part it don't forgive." Silas's hands curled into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in a childlike attempt to hold on to something that was slipping. "What happens if I walk out?" he asked. Orrin's smile was thin. "You don't. Because the door closes? Because you won't." Silas opened his mouth to argue, and that was when he heard it. Not from the chamber, not from memory, from the stairs. The faint, deliberate sound of a step. Not loud, not rushing, just one. Weight settling into old stone. Then silence. A beat later, another. Measured, unhurried, as if whatever was descending knew it had all the time in the world, and had chosen this moment anyway. Silas turned slow as frost toward the mouth of the stairwell. He saw nothing, just darkness softened by the weak echo of his flashlight. But the sound came again, closer, soft, inevitable. A ledger line being drawn one careful inch at a time. Orrin didn't move, didn't speak, didn't need to, because the woods had finally stopped waiting. And Silas Mercer, who had always believed he belonged to the forest by choice, felt, for the first time, what it meant for the forest to belong to him. The fourth step was the worst. Not because it was louder, not because it was closer, but because by the fourth step, Silas Mercer realized the sound had learned him. Boat hail. Wait. Pause. Like someone walking, who had watched him walk long enough to understand the rhythm. He didn't run. Running doesn't make sense when the world you'd run into has already decided where you belong. He kept his eyes on the stairwell, the rough stone throat of it swallowing the faint light while his breath thinned, stretching itself into longer, quieter threads, so it wouldn't be mistaken for fear. Orrin didn't stand, didn't lift the knife, didn't even turn his head. He simply watched Silas, the way an experienced tracker watches an animal begin to understand the trap wasn't steel, but story. Another step. Dust whispered down from the ceiling like sifted flour. Somewhere higher up, a root creaked a small, tired complaint from a tree that had been leaning against this hill too long. Silas finally spoke, because the silence was beginning to feel like a mouth. "What's coming?" he asked. Oren's answer was gentle, almost apologetic. "Nothing new." Sov. The word sank into the earth and stayed there. Silas waited, and then at last the walker appeared. Not a figure, not a ghost, not an animal, or a man. Just a pair of boots, old leather, cracked and darkened, soles worn thin. They moved with the slow certainty of creek water finding its lowest place. Each step was careful, respectful, the way mountain folk tread in winter so as not to test the ice too hard. There were legs in them. Yes, denim gone soft with wear and the suggestion of a body attached. But the light refused to gather enough to explain him. He seemed made of habit more than flesh, more of pattern than person. Silas knew those boots, not personally, not specifically, but he knew the kind of man who wore them. Same gait, same weight, same conversation with the ground that said, "I know you, and in knowing you, I forget you can still kill me." The knot man stopped at the bottom of the stairs, just inside the threshold, close enough that Silas could feel the temperature of him, not cold, not warm, like soil turned by a shovel on an overcast day, fresh and old at the same time. The chamber did not react, because the chamber didn't have to. Silas wet his lips. "Who are you?" The boots shifted slightly, a patient adjustment, as if the question had been expected but didn't particularly matter. When the voice came, it sounded like it had been pulled through wood grain and kept in a drawer for decades, not echoing, not spooky, just used to being obeyed. "Ledger?" Silas swallowed. "You mean..." But the voice, if it was a voice, was already talking again, unbothered by human pacing. "You carry more forest than most. Roots remember feet like yours. Soft, careful. Weight spread easy so the mud don't mind." Silas's heart beat once hard enough to feel like a bruise. "I don't know you," he said, less defiant now, more like a statement he hoped was true. The boots took one step forward, just one, a courtesy, perhaps so he could hear better. "Forest, don't keep your sins," the voice said. "Forest keeps your shape, how you move, where you stop, what you take with your hands, and what you leave with your silence." Another pause. "And what you forgive yourself for that the ground doesn't." "Oh, Silas felt something old shift inside his ribs, the memory of a single loud crack in the winter woods, a doe collapsing into snow with steam leaving her like spirit, and the little prayer he'd stuffed in his throat afterward that made it all simpler than it really was. He hadn't thought about that in years. He didn't want to now. "This isn't justice," he said. Quiet, because the room had no use for shouting. "No," the voice agreed. "It's older than that." And Oren stirred for the first time, a slow, brittle sound of fabric. He didn't look at the voice. He looked at Silas. "Ledger don't weigh guilt," he said softly. "It weighs presence. Forest took too much into itself through me. Had to hold me to slow the taking." He nodded toward the boots. "And it don't enjoy the job." Silas stared at the stairwell a moment longer, then finally forced himself to look straight into the half-formed person at the bottom of it. "What happens to you?" he asked Oren quietly. "If I stay?" For a heartbeat, Oren didn't answer. "Then, I get to go home." The words landed so softly that the traps didn't even seem to hear them. Silas pictured, unbidden, a kitchen window with faded curtains, a gravel drive, a woman standing there far younger than she'd be now, waiting for footsteps that never came. "You think she's still there?" Silas asked. Oren didn't smile, didn't cry. He simply said, "Home changes to fit the part of you that needs it." Silas closed his eyes. That seemed unfairly true. The boots shifted again, patient, unhurried. "Forest ain't greedy," the voice said. "Don't need your life. Needs your staying. Needs your breath on cold mornings, and your weight on spring mud so the ledger knows the taking is slowed. Needs a listener who doesn't lie about footsteps." Silas opened his eyes. "My job," he said softly. "You're asking me to keep doing my job. Just here." Oren nodded once. "Only difference is, you don't clock out." Silas almost laughed. It came out wrong, half broken, more air than sound. He looked at the traps, iron jaws waiting to rust all the way back into ore. He looked at Orin, a man whittled down to patience and regret. He looked at the boots, the shape of attention the forest had chosen to wear. Then he thought of the ridge at dawn, of fog lifting like pale silk, of the moment every morning when the forest decided, quietly, to let him live another day. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether he'd loved these mountains, or whether, very slowly, very gently, they had learned how to love him. "I don't want to disappear," he said. The voice didn't soften. It didn't need to. "You won't," and Silas believed it, because some people vanish from the world like a dropped stone, and others simply sink into the place that has been holding them all along. Another step, closer now, close enough that Silas could see just the faintest suggestion of a face, not features, not identity, just the kind of face people remember in stories, told around tables long after the facts have gone brittle. The voice spoke again. Ledger asks once. Silas felt the question in the air. Not spoken, not forced, just present, and behind it, like an aftertaste, a promise. If he answered yes, the debt would ease. Orin would walk out of the woods. The traps would rust in peace, and the forest would sleep a little easier knowing someone was still counting the things that should not be taken. Silas found his hands had relaxed. He breathed in the damp smell of earth. He listened because he had always listened to the trees above them whispering in slow, wooden language. He did not answer yet, because some choices demand the dignity of silence, even when the woods already know how you'll choose. There are moments in a life that don't feel like moments at all. They feel like landforms, ridgelines you didn't know you'd been walking toward your entire life, until suddenly the trail ends and there is nothing left but sky and the long old breath of the world looking back at you. Silas stood in the dead house beneath the Appalachian trees and realized the ridge had come to him. The boots waited. Orin waited. The traps, their open jaws, patient as years seemed to wait too. The forest did not press. It simply offered its silence like a hand. Silas thought not of death, not of duty, but of mornings, of coffee poured in chipped enamel mugs, of frost clinging to the edges of fallen leaves like a lace collar, of bear tracks softened by overnight snow, of the small, ordinary miracles that made a man forget he was fragile. He thought of how the woods had never once pretended to love him, but had never once lied to him either. And he thought of all the things that get taken because the world has learned to call taking by easier names. He didn't make a speech. He didn't even sigh. He simply nodded, a small, human movement, barely more than a breath turning its head. Orin closed his eyes, just for a heartbeat. When he opened them again, something in him had loosened, as if a knot tied in the marrow had finally worked itself free. He looked at Silas, really looked, and for the first time there was gratitude without guilt resting behind the exhaustion. "Forest hears you," he said softly. The boots stepped forward once, and Silas felt the mountain shift around him like a great animal settling its weight more comfortably. Not crushing, not trapping, just claiming. The voice that Dror kept, wood-worn voice, spoke again, with the patience of lichen explaining time to stone. Death is slower now. The air relaxed. Somewhere above them, the wind changed direction, not a sign, not an omen, just a small, natural correction. Even the dust in the flashlight beam seemed to drift a little easier. Silas didn't feel himself dissolve. He didn't feel anything enter him, or leave him, or mark him. He just stayed. He stayed the way roots stay, not out of refusal or fear, but because they finally understand there has never been anywhere else for them to go. He turned not toward the stairs, not toward the boots, but toward the quiet, and the quiet accepted him. Orin stood slow, careful, as if the room might crumble if he moved too quickly. He picked up his hat, brushed an imaginary fleck of dust from the brim, then placed it on his head in a gesture so ordinary it broke Silas's heart more cleanly than anything else could have. "You'll count them better than I did," Orin said gently. "You'll know when enough is enough." Silas didn't answer. He didn't have to. Orin walked past the boots, past the traps, toward the staircase that led up and out of the earth. He paused at the first step, one hand resting briefly against the stone, like a man touching the shoulder of an old friend he might never see again. "Thank you," he whispered. The forest didn't respond. It didn't need thanks. It had always wanted balance, not worship. He climbed, slowly, each footstep echoing soft as falling leaves. And with every step, the chamber felt a little less crowded, like winter letting go of a field it had been holding under snow. Silas closed his eyes. He listened because that had always been the thing he did best, to the sound of Orin's leaving. It faded, not like a man walking away, more like a story finishing itself. Eventually, there was only the soft breathing of the mountain, and the low, patient company of rusted teeth, and the knowledge, deep as bedrock, that the ledger was at peace for now. Time did not stop. It simply stopped needing to be counted. And what I sighing. I guess, by the time Orin Ketteridge reached the tree line, the day had gone pale. Not bright, not warm, just a soft, forgiving gray, the kind of weather that doesn't ask questions. He walked like a man relearning the world from the soles up, surprised by the breeze against his cheeks, by the smell of leaf rot and rain weight and the delicate sweetness of far-off wood smoke. He stopped once to rest his hand against the bark of a tulip poplar, and the tree in its way accepted that too. Briar's Gap had changed. Of course it had. Cars spoke with different accents. Houses wore new roofs. The gas station had been painted and repainted enough times that only the concrete remembered its original color. But when Orin knocked at a certain door on a quiet road with a sagging porch, someone answered. Not the woman he had expected, not the girl he had married. Because time does what time does. Someone else. Someone kind. Someone who saw in the set of his shoulders, in the shape of his eyes, enough of the man they'd heard about all their lives to open the door all the way. He stepped inside, and the mountain let him. Oh, thanks for watching. I wanted People still hike the ridges above that hollow. They still lose their way sometimes. They still leave offerings without realizing that's what they're doing. A hand pressed respectfully against bark. A piece of trash picked up without complaint. A whispered apology spoken without knowing who it's meant for. And deep beneath the roots, in a room where iron teeth grow old and the air always tastes faintly of rain and metal and memory, Silas Mercer listens. He counts what should not be taken. He remembers the difference between ownership and stewardship. And when the ledger begins to tip even slightly, the mountain sighs and rights itself. Not with anger, not with wrath, just with the quiet certainty of a place that will not forget what it is, no matter how often men do. Sometimes, very rarely, bootsteps descend the stairs. They never have to fall far, because the forest already knows exactly who belongs to it. The 3 a.m. radio signal. Insomnia has a shape. Adrian Cole had learned this the hard way. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with horror movie screaming or seizures or blood vessels bursting behind the eyes. It came like water creeping beneath a door. Slow, patient, quietly drowning all the hours that used to belong to sleep. By the time he noticed how bad it had gotten, nights weren't nights anymore. They were a corridor long, fluorescent, repeating, and he walked it alone. So he started listening to the radio, not streaming, not curated playlists, just radio. Something about the in-between frequencies soothed him, the soft hiss, the low hum, the faint crackle like static snow falling forever. He'd lay in bed at 217, 243, 258A, tuning across the band like a fisherman dragging a line through black water, waiting for something living to tug back. Most nights, the only company he had was weather alerts and bored overnight hosts talking about traffic accidents and baseball scores as though the world were soft and simple. But one night, the tuner slipped just a little too far. A seam opened in the dark. The digital readout settled on a frequency he didn't remember existing. He Billingsendered C. No call sign, no music, no ads, just silence. Then, at 3 a.m., exactly the silence, aligned, a low carrier tone thrummed to life, soft and steady. Like a heart monitor inside the walls, Adrian leaned closer. The voice arrived without ceremony, calm, unhurried, genderless. In that way, radio voices sometimes are professional, smoothed by years of not being allowed to belong to any one person. It spoke like news, like inventory, like weather. Elaine Porter. Elevator shaft collapse. Halifax Financial Tower, 11:42 a.m. Unquote. Adrian frowned, squinting at the clock on his nightstand, more annoyed than alarmed. 3-8. He listened. The voice continued, each name spoken gently, almost kindly. Ravi Malhotra. Natural gas explosion. Kingston Avenue, 4:09 p.m. Thomas Green. Struck by fallen tree limb, Pine Hollow Park, 7:23 p.m. Each line the same. Name, event, location, time. No commentary, no drama, just schedule. After 15 names, the frequency slipped into static again. The carrier tone faded. The world exhaled. Adrian stared at the radio. Okay, he muttered softly. Sure, fine. Weird pirate broadcast. Whatever. He wrote it off, because you can write anything off at 3 a.m. if you're tired enough. But the next day, as he doom-scrolled headlines over burnt toast and cold coffee, the names began to appear. Elevator malfunction leaves local woman dead. Identified as 2-year-old Elaine Porter. He stopped chewing. He scrolled further. Gas leak explosion kills 4-year-old Ravi Malhotra. Pronounced dead at the scene. His stomach turned cold. By the time he found the story about the tree limb, the toast tasted like cardboard in his mouth. Coincidence? It had to be. But coincidence doesn't usually give exact times. That night, Adrian didn't lie down. He sat in the dim blue haze of his apartment, blinds drawn, desk lamp painting a faint halo over the mess of books and unopened mail, and he waited. When the clock on his laptop rolled over to 3 a.m., he turned the tuner back to 103.7. Silence. Carrier tone. Then the voice. Exactly the same timbre. Exactly the same cadence. As if last night had been a rehearsal. It read another list. 21 names this time. Every single one. The next day became fact. He started shaking. Not violently, not theatrically. Just a quiet, human tremor, the kind that begins in the diaphragm and radiates outward like cold water. That afternoon, he tried to tell someone. His coworker, Matt, stared at him over the top of his cubicle wall and laughed. A doomsday radio? Dude, you need sleep. Adrian almost laughed too. Almost. But night came again. Because it always does. And insomnia has a shape. And at 3 a.m., on the third night, the shape stepped closer. He sat cross-legged on the carpet, radio on the floor in front of him. Every light off except the thin neon glow of the clock on the microwave, spilling in from the kitchen. He didn't blink when the tone came this time. He didn't lean forward. He didn't need to. The voice began. Names, events, cities. He wrote them down, hand shaking slightly, pen scratching across the back of an old electric bill. Then, midway through the list, the voice paused, just for a beat, like a breath. Then it said, Adrian Cole. His lungs forgot how to work. The voice continued, describing an event in the same calm, reporting tone. Fatal cerebral bleed. Private residence. 3 a.m. His chest tightened. The room seemed to tilt. And then with clinical precision, the voice added, subject seated on carpeted floor, one knee raised, left hand resting on the radio casing, apartment blinds drawn, single lamp off, blue light source from adjacent kitchen, heart rate elevated, pupil dilation present. Adrian stared at the radio. The radio stared back. And the voice. His voice? A voice. A mouth in the dark? Described the exact room around him as though it were reading a police report written in real time. He swallowed. His throat clicked loudly in the silence. The voice paused again. This time, it sounded closer. Not louder, closer, like it no longer needed the speaker to reach him. He lifted one trembling hand to his neck without knowing why. His fingertips brushed his throat. He felt something, a vibration, tiny, steady, a resonance not quite in the flesh and not quite in the air. And the last thing the voice said calmly, gently, with the tender care of someone reading a bedtime story directly into the inside of his bones was, please remain tuned. The carrier tone faded. The radio fell silent. And Adrian Cole sat very, very still, realizing that whatever was broadcasting was not coming from the station at all. It was coming from him. Adrian didn't move for a long time. Stillness can feel like safety, if you want it badly enough. The room held its breath with him. The refrigerator hummed. The building's old pipes clicked somewhere in the walls, sounding like distant knuckles. Traffic whispered outside in soft ribbons, the way it always had, as if nothing in the world had changed, except his throat, except the fact that, now that he knew to listen, He could feel a second pulse beneath his skin, his own heartbeat steady, anxious, human, and layered beneath it. Something else. Not a beat, a tone. A tremor pitched just low enough to feel rather than hear a vibration skating across cartilage and bone like a silent tuning fork pressed inside him. He swallowed. The vibration shifted with the movement, not fading, not strengthening, merely acknowledging the action the way a machine logs input. He lifted the radio, held it to his ear. Silence. He turned the volume up. White hiss filled the room like falling snow, comforting, familiar, ordinary. He set the dial to 103.7 again. Static. Unremarkable. Completely, utterly dead. He waited for the relief that should have followed. It didn't come, because he already knew. The broadcast didn't care about the radio. The radio was a confession. A toy. A prop. The true receiver was his attention, and the true transmitter was his throat. He lay back on the carpet, one hand pressed gently against his neck, feeling the low tremor whispering through the tissue like an animal moving through tall grass. He laughed, quietly, a short, breathless sound that wasn't joy and wasn't madness, just the body trying to expel a truth it could not digest. "Okay," he murmured to no one. "Okay, we're doing this, I guess." He didn't sleep. Of course he didn't. The next morning, sunlight arrived without permission. It crept under the blinds and spread itself thinly across the apartment. Pale and unwelcome, Adrian watched dust float through the light, each particle following its own small orbit. He opened his laptop. Headlines. He didn't want to check. He checked anyway. Every name read the night before, including his own, had found its obituary. Only, not his. Not yet. He closed the laptop slowly, as if the act of doing it too quickly might summon gravity. He went to work. He answered emails. He microwaved soup. He nodded through conversations he did not hear. The world, infuriatingly, continued to function. Coffee machines gurgled. Printers shrieked. His coworker Matt told a boring story about traffic, and the whole time, Adrian carried inside him a soft, secret frequency that hummed with the patience of a machine that would outlive him. He tried to ignore it. He failed. That night, he unplugged the radio. He locked it in a desk drawer. Then, just to be safe, he put the desk chair under the handle, as if the radio might decide to crawl back out and tune itself. He felt ridiculous. He also felt slightly better. Until 3 a.m. He hadn't meant to stay awake. He simply never went to sleep. At the exact moment the clock turned 3, the apartment aligned again. The refrigerator hum fell into step with something deeper. The traffic outside vanished. Even the air conditioning paused, as though yielding the floor to a more important speaker. And inside his throat, the tone rose. Not loud, not painful, just inexorably present. His mouth opened. He didn't tell it to. His tongue moved. He did not grant it permission. And in a calm, measured voice that sounded like his own, stripped of every quirk, every warmth, every living contour, Adrian spoke. He spoke names. He spoke times. He spoke the tiny, indifferent footnotes of doom, a truck skidding through a crosswalk, a swimming accident under a cloudy sky, a scaffolding bolt that had been waiting too long to fail. He listened to himself like a stranger. He wanted to bite down, to close his mouth, to interrupt, but the sound did not care whether his teeth were clenched. The voice did not need his consent, or his breath, or even his decision to participate. It lived deeper than muscle. It lived where words begin, and then at the end of the list. As if reading the closing paragraph of a script, his throat shaped the familiar syllables of his own name. Adrian Cole. Cerebral bleed. Private residence. 3 a.m. And like last time, the voice described the room. Not just that he sat on the carpet, but the fact that tonight, his back rested against the couch instead of the wall, that his right hand now gripped his knee, that a single tear marked his cheek and was cooling on his skin. It narrated him into being. It authenticated him. And somehow, that was the part that terrified him more than the death sentence. Because it meant the voice wasn't predicting. It was observing, meaning it was in the room, meaning it was in him. The tone subsided. 3:12 a.m. His mouth closed. His body released control back to him with the bored indifference of a clock you've just wound too tight. He didn't scream. He didn't throw the radio. He simply sat there, hand at his throat, and understood, with the clarity of a man hearing a diagnosis spoken from behind medical glass. He was not listening to the signal. He was the signal, and if the world kept turning, it was only because he kept talking. The first rule of panic is that it wants to run. The second rule is that it can't. Adrian spent the following day inside a narrow corridor between those two rules, pacing it like a trapped animal inside his own skin. He worked. He spoke to people. He even laughed once at something Matt said, and hated the sound of it the moment it left his mouth. All the while, the soft tone lived in his throat, not loudly, not insistently, just there, like gravity. He thought about doctors. He thought about MRI machines, and specialists, and polished rooms that smelled like bleach and hope. But he also thought about the list, about the way every name he spoke found a headline. And he imagined a white-walled office where a physician said, "Describe the problem," and imagined what might happen if, at exactly 3 a.m., he opened his mouth and spoke death into 67 different corners of the world while sitting 5 feet from a water cooler. What happens when cause and effect has an audience? He went home instead. He unplugged his router. He removed the batteries from every clock, then regretted it, because not knowing the time was worse. He opened a blank notebook, drew a line down the middle of the first page. Control variables. Outcomes. He stared at the blank paper until it looked like a threat. Then, he waited. When 3 a.m. arrived, his body knew before his eyes did. The air recalibrated, the building stilled, and the tone rose gently through his throat like a submerged bell. He grabbed the pen. He wrote as he spoke. Name, event, city, time. His handwriting stayed neat. That frightened him more than anything. Halfway through the list, he changed something. He didn't know why he chose that entry. It was random. He only remembered the way the syllables sat in his mouth. Caroline Shoe, wrong way collision, State Highway 14, 2:19 p.m. He stopped. He took a breath that didn't quite belong to him, and, very carefully, he tried to lie. Caroline Shoe, his mouth said calmly. Bus stop incident. 6:54 p.m. He waited for resistance. There was none. His voice just kept going on to the next entry as if truth had not just been bent out of its normal shape. The tone subsided at 3:12. He closed the notebook with shaking hands. He did not sleep. Morning came. He brewed coffee he didn't taste, and then he watched. At 2:19 p.m., nothing happened on State Highway 14. He refreshed traffic feeds. He checked police alerts. He followed local news accounts from 3 states away. Nothing. His chest loosened not in relief, exactly, but in confirmation. At 6:54 p.m., a car mounted a curb beside a bus stop in a city Adrian had never visited. 1 dead. Caroline Shoe, 27. Witnesses described the scene with all the tender horror of people who had expected to get home, eat, sleep, and instead had been drafted into a stranger's last moments. Adrian closed the tabs. He stood at the sink and let the water run over his hands until the skin turned raw and white. He had changed the world, not nudged it, not forecast it, authored it, and the knowledge settled into him like a slow toxin, not killing quickly, just rewriting the rules of what his reflection meant. That night, he took more drastic steps. He wrote a list of names, not real ones, invented, people who did not exist. He waited for 3 a.m. When the tone rose, he lunged ahead of it, spoke over the impulse, forcing his mouth to form sounds that the voice hadn't prepared. Jacob Feld. Lightning strike. 9:31 p.m. His throat resisted a muscle spasm, a refusal like trying to breathe underwater. For a moment, he couldn't continue. Then the voice accepted the offering. It slid around his attempt like water, smoothing it, owning it, speaking it again more calmly as if correcting his pronunciation. The list continued. He didn't sleep. He waited. The next day, at 9:31 p.m., a man named Jacob Feld was killed by a lightning strike in a state Adrian had never been to. The obituary, written by a grieving sister, included a childhood photo. The boy had existed all along. Adrian just hadn't known him until he'd said his name. He shut the laptop lid like he was closing a wound. His hand trembled. He didn't know whether the trembling was fear or responsibility trying to grow a spine. On the fourth night, he went further. He tried to omit a name. When the list rose inside him, clinical, calm, inevitable, he clamped his jaw closed with so much force he tasted blood. The voice did not stop. It did not need his mouth. It spoke behind his teeth, vibrating the hinge of his jaw like a trapped insect rattling glass. His lips stayed shut. The name still entered the world. He could not erase. He could only shape. And the most terrifying discovery came next. On the fifth night, he whispered a name not on the list. A name he had been carrying like a stone all day. Heavy and guilt-cold. Matthew Carter. Car engine failure. Interstate 81. 11:07 p.m. His co-worker. Boring Matt. Matt who brought him coffee, sometimes without asking. Because friends do that. And Adrian had forgotten how to name that sort of thing. The voice hesitated. For the first time, hesitated. The tone warbled, like a line pulled across ice that wasn't sure where the cracks were. And then the voice spoke the name again more confidently this time and kept going. The list finished. Send in Sharfen. Silence. Adrian stared at the dark. He had done something terrible, not because he meant harm, but because he wanted to know if he could. The next day, he waited for 11:07 p.m. With the sick patience of someone watching a door they locked themselves. At 10:53, Matt texted him. Stuck on the interstate flat tire. Lol. Roadside assist says 20 minutes. At 11:05, Adrian typed a reply. Something banal and careful and human. He never hit send. Because at 11:07 p.m., a jack slipped on a slanted strip of asphalt, and the car came down hard across Matt's chest. The report would later describe it as a freak accident. There is no such thing as a freak when the universe reads from a script. That night, Adrian sat in the bathroom with the shower running full heat, steam slicking the tiles. Humid air thickened his throat and pressed his palm against his neck until he could not feel the tone anymore. He wept into his wrist like a child, trying not to wake the house. Because the house was already awake. Because the house lived inside him now. And he began, slowly, painfully, to understand. The voice didn't predict what would happen. It didn't choose. It merely required a mouth. And the worst truth of all was this. If he ever stopped speaking the list would not stop existing. It would just find another throat. And that possibility, the idea of anyone else carrying this frequency, horrified him more than any death he had read into being. So, he made a decision. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't rational. It was simply the only thing that felt like an answer. He would keep speaking. And he would try with a care that bordered on reverence to move threads of fate wherever he could. To spare who could be spared. To bend the outcomes gently towards something less cruel. Even if the world bled in different places because of it. Because somebody had to. And the voice, the tone, the gentle, indifferent machine that lived inside his throat sounded almost relieved. The list began to feel like weather. Not a warning. Not a threat. Just something that arrived because the earth turned. Adrian built his days around it. He napped at odd hours. He quit caffeine because he didn't want jittered hands to feel like guilt. He learned to breathe evenly as 3 a.m. approached so the tone inside his throat wouldn't ride the shaky rhythm of fear. He made columns. He made plans. He learned, painfully, that the voice did not care about obituary detail. It spoke headlines, so he tried to carve mercies into the margins. If the list said, collision, he whispered, minor injuries. If it said fall, he added, rescued. If it said single fatality, he swallowed hard and inserted the word escaped into the shape of the sentence, like a prayer pretending to be grammar. Sometimes it worked. He saw news stories about survivors pulled from wreckage, about people who walked away when statistics said they shouldn't have. He didn't always know which lines had been his doing. He only knew that the voice never argued when he softened the edges, but there was always a cost. Sometimes the headline shifted sideways. A collision avoided on one street becomes a double collision on another. A lightning strike misses the man he named and hits the neighbor instead. Nothing vanished. Everything moved. And the ledger, he realized, didn't mind whose name filled the blank, only that the blank did not stay empty. Still, he couldn't stop trying. Not after Matt. Not after learning what it felt like to be the verb in someone else's tragedy. So when the list said, Clara Jensen, pedestrian fatality, Maple and 5th, 2:52 p.m., He did something he had never done before. He intervened in person. He didn't know Clara Jensen, but the city wasn't large, and Maple and Fifth was the kind of intersection that appeared in local news often enough to feel like a familiar mouth. He called in sick. He arrived 30 minutes early. He leaned against a lamppost and tried not to look like the kind of man who stands near lampposts for reasons. The afternoon unfolded with ordinary detail: school buses exhaling children, cyclists carving cautious arcs through traffic, the sky wearing that washed-out blue that feels like the color of denial. Ardian Sishavin. He checked every face. He didn't know which one belonged to her. Ardian Sishabafin. A woman in a red coat paused at the curb phone in hand, brow furrowed and Adrian's skin prickled, because sometimes the body knows before the mind catches up. Ardare Wujafin. She stepped forward with the small, apologetic smile of someone who doesn't want to inconvenience traffic. In the truck, late delivery. Driver distracted rolled the stop sign as if the law were only a rumor. Time fractured. Adrian moved before he decided to. He grabbed the woman's arm and pulled. She yelped, startled, angry, but the truck brushed past her by inches rather than inches plus bone. It clipped the lamppost. Metal shrieked. No one died. The driver stumbled out, shaking. The woman in the red coat stared at Adrian, disbelief, gratitude, suspicion all braided together, and said, breathlessly, "You saved my life." He didn't say, "I was only rearranging the list." He didn't say, "The radio lives in my throat." He just nodded. He went home. He felt something inside him, unclench, not triumph, not righteousness, something quieter, something like permission. That night, when 3 a.m. came, and the tone rose, he braced for the new list. It began as always. Name, event, city, time. He waited to hear Clara Jensen. He didn't. He exhaled slowly. Maybe, just maybe, the ledger had accepted the change. Halfway through the broadcast, his throat slowed. The tone wavered. The voice paused for a quarter second like a stylus hopping a groove. Then it said, "Unknown female. Maple and Fifth. 2:55 p.m. Adrian's heart stuttered. "Construction worker." And the voice continued calmly. "Fatal cranial trauma. Debris impact." He squeezed his eyes shut. He saw it. Not as a vision, just as terrible, simple math. The lamppost the truck had struck the impact had loosened it. At 2:55, a worker inspecting the damage would stand too close when the weakened fixture gave up its grip on the afternoon. The voice read more names. It concluded, as always, with his. Adrian Cole. Cerebral bleed. Private residence. 3 a.m. And then, as if it had saved the most invasive detail for last, it described him. Subject seated upright on bathroom floor. Back against tub. Palms against neck. Mouth closed. Water running. Lights off. His breath staggered, because that was exactly where he was. The apartment fell still again. Send in sharp and silence. He pressed harder at his throat without meaning to, as if he could compress the signal into something smaller, something less capable of hurting the world just by existing. His palm slipped on the heat-damp skin. He wept again, not the wild grief of a broken heart, but the tired grief of someone who has just learned that every solution is a subtle form of the problem, because the truth was simple and cruel. You cannot save someone from the list. You can only move the list through different names, and his own name never moved. That was the circle tightening. The next night, he made another experiment. He replaced his death with someone else's. He hated himself while doing it. He said the words like a confession he wanted the world to reject. Adrian Cole. Non-fatal episode. Full recovery. The tone didn't fight. The voice accepted the revision. The next day, he read the list in the news. All the names, all the tragedies, and his own was missing for the first time. He expected relief. He felt nothing. He ate toast. He sat at his desk. He watched the clock roll toward 3 a.m. with the calm of a man waiting to hear if his lie had weight. It did not. At 3 a.m., the voice still said his name, still described the room, still wrote him into the script inevitable as sunrise with the smooth, indifferent certainty of a clerk who doesn't question the paperwork. And he understood. His own entry was not editable, because the list did not travel outward from him. It collapsed inward. His name was the axis. The frequency had always been tuning to him. The casualties were orbit. The thought landed softly. He rested his head against the cool tile. He let the water run because silence felt too harsh now. And the most terrible truth arrived then gently, like a kind hand meaning well in the dark. If his name was the Axis, then when he died, the signal would move on. It would pick another throat, another insomniac, another mouth to speak the world into fracture. He could imagine them already, someone, somewhere, rubbing their neck at 3 a.m., wondering why their body felt like a tuning fork. And he realized that the only way to protect anyone at all was not to save the people on the list, not to bargain, not to lie, but simply to keep living for as long as humanly possible, to hold the axis, to carry the tone, to bear the weight until his voice wore out, or his body failed, or the universe got bored of neat little lists and tried something else. He lay on the bathroom floor until dawn, throat humming like a second heartbeat, the tile warm beneath him from the water he had forgotten to turn off. And for the first time, he did not feel hunted. He felt employed. Time became a maintenance schedule. Eat, hydrate, walk. Avoid stress. Avoid risk. Avoid stairs when you're tired. Avoid ice in winter. Avoid traffic. Avoid irony. Most people live like the future is a large, cloudy thing they can only guess at. Adrian lived like the future was a fragile machine he was responsible for keeping plugged in, because as long as he remained upright and breathing, the axis held, the list had a mouth, and it was his. He found odd comforts. He took long baths with the lights off. The radio stayed unplugged, but he kept it anyway, a relic. A prop from the first act of a play whose third act had outgrown props entirely. Sometimes he held it the way a child holds a stuffed animal, not because it helps, but because it belongs to the story. He kept a notebook filled with small mercies, places where he'd bent the edges without tearing the page. Non-fatal. Rescued. Survives. It didn't make the world kinder, but it made it less cruel on purpose. And sometimes that was enough to let him breathe. Nights came, like they always do. 3A, toned, names, quiet. He spoke them with a strange tenderness, the way a hospice nurse might say a name while smoothing a blanket, because being the voice of doom didn't mean he had to be unkind. And for a while, that was the shape of his life. The change began so gently that at first he thought it was exhaustion. He started waking up in different rooms. Once, sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly, a glass of water untouched beside him. Once, standing at the window, blinds half open, forehead resting against the cool glass like a man praying to the weather. There were faint red lines on his throat one morning, not bruises, just the soft imprint of fingers that were somehow his and not his. He began to suspect that there were two hims, the one who waited for 3 a.m. and the one who belonged to it. So he made another experiment. He filmed himself. He set the camera on the bookshelf, angled toward the living room where he usually waited. A small green light blinked in the dark, a polite witness. He didn't watch the footage for 3 days. He couldn't. When he finally pressed play, morning light filled the apartment, harmless, ordinary, and he sat on the couch like a man about to read a medical report with his own name in the header. The video began. 2:57 a.m. He saw himself sitting cross-legged on the rug. Calm. Still. Eyes open but unfocused, like someone listening to a distant sound the mic couldn't catch. At 2:59, he stood, not mechanically, not like a puppet, just inevitably. He walked to the kitchen. He opened a cabinet. He took out a glass and filled it with water he would not drink. He walked back and placed the glass on the table with the care of someone setting an altar. 3A. His throat moved. He spoke. No radio. No device. Just his mouth forming names, dates, details, and that same calm newsroom cadence. Except now, hearing it without his own terror layered over it. It didn't sound like a stranger at all. It sounded like him, except empty, like the version of him that had been sanded down to the essentials. Breath, articulation, function. Halfway through the list, something else happened. He walked, still speaking, to the bathroom. The camera caught only the doorway and the washed-out light. He heard his own voice say the familiar line. Adrian Cole, cerebral bleed, private residence, 3 a.m. And then from the bathroom the voice continued, describing in precise, clinical detail what he was doing as he did it. back against the tub, hands at the throat, water running, mouth closed. All the details the list had read for nights on end were not coming from the radio. They were coming from the him that stayed behind, the sleepwalking him, the 3 a.m. version. He watched himself finish the list. He watched himself go still. He watched the minute hand crawl from 3:11 to 3:12, and he watched the body, his body blink, once, twice, and become him again. There was no break, no Sam, just a transfer of ownership. He stopped the video. He rewound that single minute too many times the moment the consciousness shifted until the file corrupted and the media player politely apologized. He sat very quietly at the table with the untouched water and the unplugged radio, and he finally understood the last piece of the pattern. He was not only the mouth, he was also the listener. Every night, at 3 a.m., Adrian Cole left his own body just enough that something practical could use it for inventory, and the version of him that came back afterward inherited the list like a memory, which meant the first time he had heard the list through the radio, he hadn't been receiving anything at all. He had been eavesdropping on himself. He didn't become heroic after that. He didn't become monstrous either. He simply became careful. He left notes for the 3 a.m. version, taped to the bathroom mirror, tucked under the glass, sitting on the rug like breadcrumbs. Be kind where you can. If you can soften something, soften it. And please, please let me outlive this. Some mornings, the notes were moved. Once, a new one appeared in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing it. It said, "We are trying." He folded that note into his wallet. He carried it everywhere, because it meant that the part of him that read names like weather still knew what trying was. And when the end finally came, it didn't come like a prophecy. It came like routine. Years later, older, tired, still careful, still reefed around the axis of 3 a.m., he woke one night already on the floor, back against the tub, water running. The tile was warm beneath him. His palms pressed gently to his throat as if comforting the voice that lived there, not silencing it. There was no radio. There hadn't been for a long time. He didn't struggle. He didn't plead. He listened. The tone rose familiar as breath. His mouth opened, and for the first time in all the years of lists and experiments and mercies and ledger balancing, the voice faltered, not by much, just enough. Enough that the line about Adrian Cole sounded less like a reading and more like a goodbye. He understood then, with a deep, still clarity that felt almost like sleep, that the signal wasn't killing him. It was returning him. A transmitter is only useful while it's tuned, and when it retunes, it needs an empty frequency. He exhaled. He thought, fleetingly, kindly of whoever would feel the first vibration next. Someone rubbing their throat at 3 a.m., annoyed at the world, not knowing yet that the world was already listening through them. He hoped they would be gentle. He hoped they would try. The last sound he heard wasn't the voice. It was his own breath, plain, human, his, and only his. And then the room, aligned, rank a dry foot enough. Somewhere, a radio tuner slips just a little too far. A new insomniac pauses, listens. A frequency that shouldn't exist becomes clear as prayer, and a calm, precise voice begins to read the world into shape. Not cruel, not kind, just necessary. And if you ever hear your own name spoken softly at 3 a.m., with your room described back to you like a photograph already taken, don't look for the station. Don't check the tower. Don't ask who is speaking. Just feel your throat, very gently, and see if anything answers back. The passenger in the fog. Coastal highways don't really have nights. They have weather. And tonight, the weather had swallowed everything. Fog rolled in off the Pacific like a quiet decision, thick enough that Calderouk could barely see the hood of his 18-wheeler, thick enough that the red glow of his taillight seemed to hang behind him like a pair of eyes he couldn't quite outrun. He slowed to 40, then to 30, then to the speed you drive when you've accepted you're not in charge anymore, only borrowing permission from the road. The CB crackled with static and the occasional ghost voice of another driver swearing softly into the night. But mostly it was just him. Him. The engine's low animal rumble, and the ocean breathing in the dark somewhere just beyond the guardrail. He kept the window cracked an inch. Even in the cold, salt air helped him think, Or at least, it helped him remember he was still somewhere real. He'd been running loads up and down the coast for 15 years. He'd driven through fires that turned noon into midnight and ice storms that chewed on the world with silver teeth, but nothing unsettled him like fog. Fog didn't scare you. Fog untethered you. It erased the line between motion and stillness until the road felt like a conveyor belt sliding you gently toward whatever story the night had chosen. A mile marker slid past, swallowed almost immediately, and Calder found himself gripping the wheel harder than he needed to. His knuckles blanched, pale in the dashboard glow. He told himself to ease up. He didn't, because he'd just seen something. A shape, a person, standing on the shoulder just ahead, or what passed for a shoulder on this narrow, cliff-hugging stretch of highway, thumb out, face turned toward his headlights. A hitchhiker. No reflective gear, no flashlight. Just a long coat darkened by mist and the faintest pale oval where a face should be. Damn. Calder muttered to the cab, to the empty thermos on the passenger seat, to whatever might be listening. He couldn't stop. Not safely. Not here. He eased the rig over as far as he dared anyway, giving the figure space, every muscle waiting for the sudden thud of contact that would mean he'd misjudged the edge of the world. He passed the hitchhiker. For a heartbeat, just one, he thought he saw a hand raise. Not waving, acknowledging, and then the fog folded the road back in on itself, and the night became a blank page again. Calder let out a long, shaky breath. Jesus, buddy, he murmured. Pick a better night. He checked his mirrors. Nothing but white. He drove. A few minutes later, 5 or 10 time had begun to slip sideways. The road curved inland before swinging back toward the cliff like a tired dancer repeating old choreography. And there, standing just beyond the bend, was the hitchhiker. Same coat, same posture, same pale, not quite face turning into the headlights like a moth too tired to run. Calder's mouth went dry. He slowed again, heart thumping in a rhythm out of sync with the engine, and passed the figure with the same cautious arc. He didn't look straight at it. You learned that trick as a driver. Look at the road. Always the road. He almost convinced himself it was a different person. Some lost kid walking the shoulder, moving faster than he thought. He almost believed it. Until the third time. He came out of another curve, fog billowing in eddies around the truck like breath, and the hitchhiker stood exactly where the world narrowed again, as if the night had kept placing him there like a punctuation mark. Calder's hands were slick on the wheel now. His pulse beat in places he'd forgotten had a pulse. He flicked on the high beams out of some desperate instinct, and the fog replied by turning the world into a white wall, reflecting all that light right back into his eyes. He swore and killed the brights. When his vision cleared, the hitchhiker was closer. Not on the shoulder anymore. Not in the lane, but nearer. Enough that Calder could see the edges of the coat. Heavy with wet. Enough that he realized he'd never actually seen the man's feet. Just the idea of them. He drove on. Breath shallow. Jaw tight. For a while, maybe a mile, maybe more, there was nothing but road and fog and the ocean's low. Ongoing confession in the dark. Then the radio whispered something shapeless and died. The dashboard clock flickered once, twice, then steadied, and Calder rounded another bend. The hitchhiker stood there, waiting, as if Calder's headlights were a signal the night had been expecting. This time, the figure lifted an arm, slow, smooth, and the gesture wasn't asking anymore. It was inviting. Every nerve in Calder's body said no. Every story he'd ever heard, whispered through truck stop coffee, said, keep driving. Don't stop for the night. Don't let the night inside. But terror has gravity, and there comes a point where running from something you don't understand feels worse than turning toward it and demanding to see its shape. Calder eased the truck onto the narrow gravel edge until the cab shuddered slightly and the ocean roared somewhere invisible below. He rolled down the window. Cold, wet air filled the cab, tasting like salt and old wood and fog. Hey, he called out, voice steady because it had practice. You need a ride? The hitchhiker stepped closer. Not hurried, not shy, just inevitable. Calder leaned across and unlatched the passenger door because the world had become very small and very simple, and he didn't know what else to do with his hands anymore. The door creaked open. Fog slid inside like a polite guest. The hitchhiker climbed up into the cab without a word, coat shedding droplets that sparkled briefly in the dashboard light before vanishing. He sat. He closed the door. He did not look at Calder. He stared straight ahead, as if the windshield were a movie screen, and he'd seen this one before. Calder swallowed. "You're lucky I stopped," he said, because silence had begun to feel like an animal crouched between them. Fog like this, nobody'd see you till... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't know why. The hitchhiker slowly lifted one arm, not toward Calder, not toward the road, toward the rearview mirror, and pointed. A single, patient gesture. Calder followed the line of that finger because of course he did, because when the night asks you to look, you look, and the world changed. Calder had looked into that rearview mirror a million times, to check lanes, to watch trailers, to keep the world behind him in its proper place. But this was the first time he'd ever been afraid of it. The hitchhiker's fingers stayed raised steady, insistent, polite in a way that made Calder's skin crawl worse than if the man had shouted. "All right," Calder muttered to the fog, to the windshield, to the wheel beneath his hands. "All right, I'm looking." He glanced up, just a glance, just enough to obey, because ignoring gestures inside your own cab feels like refusing gravity. For a split second, there was only what he expected. The faint outline of the sleeper berth. Shadows where a jacket sagged on a hook. The suggestion of movement that was actually just the road humming softly beneath everything. Then the mirror stuttered. Not the glass, the image. As if the world behind him had taken a breath it didn't need. And something else came into focus. Calder frowned, leaning closer. The sleeper berth was there. Yes, the rumpled blanket, the shape of the cabinets, the dent in the padded wall where he'd knocked his head once. But there was also a shape lying on the bunk. A man, face turned slightly toward the cab, eyes half-lidded, skin too pale in the dim light. Calder blinked hard, a reflex so old the body doesn't ask permission, and the shape sharpened instead of fading. Not a stranger, not a reflection. Him. He recognized the crooked nose he'd broken at 19, the scar above his brow from a chain snapping wrong in a loading yard in Fresno, the faint shadow of beard, the same tired line to the mouth. He stared. His mind did what human minds do when reality fails, to file the correct forms it reached for the nearest rational explanation, like a drowning man clutching a branch. You fell asleep? You're dreaming. You're dead. You're fine. You're losing it. Pick one. Any one. Just don't leave the thought blank. He tore his gaze away from the glass so abruptly the world tilted. His knuckles had gone bloodless on the wheel. "Okay," he whispered, voice paper thin. "Okay, that's something. That's nothing. That's a trick of the light." The hitchhiker didn't reply, didn't move, didn't even breathe. So far as Calder could tell, he just kept his hand raised toward the mirror like a man performing a blessing. Calder's heart thudded against his ribs in a rhythm that felt staccato and embarrassed, like it didn't want anyone to hear it this loud. "Listen," he said to fill the quiet, to tape the cracks. "I don't know what your deal is, but I'm already doing you a kindness here. You don't point in a moving cab. It's distracting. He risked another look, because the mind is treacherous, because the truth terrifies us, only until curiosity arrives and lays out its instruments. The mirror had changed again. Not the frame, not the angle, the scene. The cab was gone. His truck, his girl, his livelihood, his one constant was not there. Instead, the mirror now showed a different road entirely, one unspooled somewhere far below, half swallowed by night and cliff shadow. A truck lay there like a broken animal, twisted, cab crumpled, windshield starred and collapsed inward like a lung. Headlights burned weakly through fog, illuminating shredded guardrail and the ghostly outlines of scrub and rock. Steam rose in gentle curls from the wreck like breath leaving a body. 20 yards from the shattered cab, down a slope torn up by metal and momentum, lay a man in a high-vis jacket, face down, arms crooked at angles that don't have names in anatomy textbooks. Calder's stomach dropped in a slow, sickening descent. He knew that jacket. He knew that body. He gripped the wheel harder, as if pressure could keep the world from acknowledging itself. "No," he whispered. The mirror, unkind only in its honesty, allowed the fog to thin around the figure just enough that there could be no misunderstanding. It was him. Not asleep. Not dazed. Still, utterly absolutely still. Calder made a sound then that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh. A raw, bewildered thing dragged out of the center of him against its will. He looked away again, not in denial, but in self-defense. The hitchhiker had turned his head. Not far, just enough that Calder could see the profile, a suggestion of cheek and jaw, the shadow of a wet curl against the pale line of the neck. The lips moved, just a little, not forming words, forming breath. And with that breath came a smell Calder had been trying not to name since he'd picked the man up. Salt, cold metal, heat-broken plastic, and beneath it all, faint but impossible to mistake, blood. The engine ticked. The fog wrapped and unwrapped itself around the world. Somewhere far below, a wave broke with the soft, exhausted sound of something trying its best and failing quietly. Calder swallowed. His throat felt tight. "What are you?" he asked, not loud, not demanding, just tired. The hitchhiker didn't answer. Didn't need to, because Calder already knew, in the deep animal part of him that recognizes storms before clouds arrive. This man wasn't following the truck. He was following Calder, and he wasn't asking for a ride. He was making sure Calder didn't arrive anywhere he no longer belonged. Calder's vision wavered, black at the edges. The world narrowed to the wheel beneath his hands, the fog beyond the windshield, and the mirror, always the mirror. He forced his gaze back up one last time. The wreck was still there. The man at the bottom of the ravine, his body was still there. But now, standing beside it, was the hitchhiker, coat hanging heavy with mist, head bowed, as if keeping vigil. And in the cab of the living truck, the other hitchhiker sat silently in the passenger seat, hands still raised, reminding Calder, with infinite patience, to keep looking, until the truth finally stuck. Denial is a survival instinct. It's the mind laying a blanket over the body so it doesn't bolt into the dark and vanish. Calder clutched that blanket with both hands. He blinked long, hard bracing for the mirror to fall back into sense, for the ravine and the wreck and the broken patience of gravity to retreat into whatever part of the mind keeps nightmares in storage. It didn't. The man at the bottom of the drop remained exactly where the world had placed him, face half buried in torn brush, arm crooked across his chest like an afterthought, jacket sleeve torn, reflective striping glimmering weakly in the dying beam of the ruined truck below. Calder tore his eyes away. The cab swam into focus again. Steering wheel, dash lights, slow sweep of the wipers pushing fog beads across glass like trembling hands. He pressed his foot down, not hard, just enough that the engine's tone deepened, a low animal rumble carrying them forward through the white. The hitchhiker didn't resist. He didn't speak. He didn't even lower his hand. He simply sat patient as weather, watching the road he already knew wasn't there. Calder's thoughts broke into pieces and chased each other around the inside of his skull like birds startled into flight. You're alive. You're driving. You feel the wheel. You hear the engine. This is real. He focused on the facts. The seat beneath him. The faint vibration through the soles of his boots. The way the fog parted reluctantly around the hood like a curtain grudgingly drawn. He was alive. He was moving. He had to be. "See?" he said, voice stretched thin but steady enough to pass for normal if you squinted your hearing. "We're fine. He didn't finish, because the road didn't change. Not the incline, not the turns, not the faint rhythm of reflectors pulsing in and out of view. It was the same 50 yards of highway, again and again and again, subtle but wrong, like listening to a song where the chorus never resolves. Calder's brain tried to smooth it, to file it under coincidence, to say fog can do that. Fog bends light. Fog fools eyes. But something deeper, older, whispered that roads don't repeat themselves, like stuttered breath. Not unless you've left them. He swallowed. The taste of metal had crept into his mouth, that thin copper tang that lives halfway between adrenaline and memory. He glanced sideways at the hitchhiker. Droplets clung to the stranger's hair, silver bright in the dashboard glow. His coat steamed faintly in the truck's gentle warmth. His eyes were half-lidded, not with sleep, but with certainty. He was not waiting to see how this ended. He already knew. Calder wet his lips. "Where did you come from?" he asked softly. The hitchhiker didn't answer, but his raised hand shifted, not lowering, just angling slightly, like a compass needle acknowledging a new north, back toward the mirror. Calder shook his head hard enough that the cab blurred. "No," he whispered. "Not again." He stared forward, locked on the white smear of the world, forcing himself to exist inside what his hands could touch. The truck drove. The engine hummed. The road unspooled. Fog wrapped it all like gauze around a wound no one wanted to look at. He clung to it. He clung so tightly he almost didn't notice the silence. Not the normal kind. Missing kind. No wind around the trailer. No whisper of tires sluicing through damp. No distant ocean. Just the sound of machinery, isolated, as if the world outside the cab had been unplugged and wheeled down the hall into another room. His scalp prickled. He glanced at the mirror before he could stop himself. The ravine waited, unmoved, unchanging. The truck below still breathed weakly through crumpled metal lungs. Headlights washed the rocks in a sickly, unwavering glow, and his body had rolled onto its back now, as if the ground had tried to make him more comfortable. His face was pale. His chest didn't move. There was blood at the corner of his mouth, but it was already turning dark, already thickening into something less intimate than life. Calder choked on his own breath. "No," he said, not to the hitchhiker, not to the mirror, to the universe. "No. I would know. I'd feel it. His hand drifted to his ribs. He pressed. He felt nothing wrong. No brokenness. No betrayal of bone. His skin was warm. His pulse beat stubbornly in his throat. Alive. He was alive. He had to be. The mirror didn't argue. It didn't need to. It simply held the truth the way glass always does. Faithfully. Gently. Without favoritism. Calder's vision blurred. He blinked tears away with the angry efficiency of a man who doesn't cry in front of strangers, not even strange ones who might be ghosts. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. The hitchhiker finally moved, his raised hand lowered to his lap. He turned his head slowly, quietly, and for the first time Calder saw the man's full face. He was young, younger than Calder had imagined, mid-20s, maybe the kind of youth that still hasn't lost the softness around the eyes. But that softness had been rewritten, not hardened, not aged, just emptied, as if something had scooped out the ordinary worries and left room for something larger, colder, inevitable. When he spoke, his voice sounded like fog learning to use lungs. "Don't drive," he said gently. Calder stared at him. "That's it?" he rasped. "That's your big advice?" The hitchhiker blinked. He didn't look offended. He didn't look anything. "It's not a road anymore," he said. Calder laughed. A short, cracking sound dragged over gravel. He pointed out the windshield with a shaking hand. "Looks like a road," he said. "Feels like a road. I've been on roads my whole goddamn life. I'd know the difference." End quote. The hitchhiker tilted his head very slightly. "Then look again." Calder did. Not up, not forward. He looked down, at the speedometer, at the tack, at the trembling needle marking a steady 60, and the odometer that hadn't changed in miles. He stared. A sick, slow understanding began to loosen the floor beneath his heart. The truck wasn't moving. The world wasn't moving. Only he was suspended in a fog that wasn't weather at all. He whispered, "So, where am I?" The hitchhiker didn't answer right away. He looked toward the mirror again, toward the ravine, toward the stillness waiting there like a signature. Then he turned back and met Calder's eyes, and there was compassion there, sudden and deep, like a light glimpsed far beneath water. "Catching up," he said softly. Calder swallowed. The cab felt smaller now, closer, like a memory trying to hold its shape. He pressed his palm flat against the wheel, as if to anchor himself to the last real object in the universe. "I don't want to," he said, not defiant, just honest. The hitchhiker nodded once. "No one does." Outside, the fog thickened, not drifting now, not wandering, but gathering, like a door closing. And Calder Rook, 15 years on the coast, 3 million safe miles, one heart with too much salt in it, realized there are moments the world stops arguing with you. It simply waits. There is a silence that belongs to hospitals, another that belongs to churches, and another still older, lonelier that belongs to the ocean at night. That was the silence that stepped into the cab. It didn't replace the engine hum, didn't mute the dashboard lights. It simply settled in beside them, like fog pushed up against glass, reminding Calder that there were older rules than traffic laws and tachometers. The hitchhiker watched him with that same quiet patience, that shoreline compassion that doesn't promise safety but promises honesty. Calder swallowed. His voice, when it came, sounded like it had walked a long way to get there. So, I crashed. A nod, and He couldn't finish. The word burned. Sat on the tongue like metal. The hitchhiker saved him the cruelty of saying it. "You're dying," he said gently. "Not gone. Not yet. You're between. Way." Calder let out a slow breath he hadn't known he'd been keeping prisoner. Between. It fit. It explained the road that wasn't. The odometer stuck in an eternal mile. The fog that wasn't, weather so much as boundary. "And what is this?" he asked, gesturing around the cab, the wheel, the dash, the empty thermos, the soft rumble of the engine that felt like a memory of warmth rather than heat itself. "A place you recognize," the hitchhiker said, "so you don't have to feel lost while you get ready." "Ready for what?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached slow, careful, and unlatched the passenger door. Fog rolled in like a tide. Beyond it, nothing. Not darkness, not light, just white with depth, like standing inside a cloud that had learned to hold a shape. Calder's pulse lurched. He clung to the wheel like it could argue on his behalf. "I'm not going anywhere. Here, look." The hitchhiker nodded, as though this, too, was expected. "That's all right. We don't drag anyone." He slid out of the truck, boots disappearing immediately into the whiteness, as if the ground lived only as long as his feet remembered it. He didn't vanish. He simply reduced, softened, became part of the weather. Calder stared after him, throat tight. "Who are you?" he called, voice trembling on the edge of anger and pleading. The reply drifted back through the fog, close and far at once. "Once? I was like you." Calder frowned. "What happened?" The shape paused. Then, softly, "I walked too late." Something in that sentence, its weight, its tired truth lodged inside Calder like a hook. He looked toward the mirror again, down into the ravine. The scene hadn't changed. His truck lay in its final geometry. Headlights still burned, one brighter than the other, turning the narrow patch of world into a theater of broken metal and bad decisions. And his body, it hadn't moved at all. The angle of the neck, the skew of the arm, the stillness. It wasn't sleeping, wasn't stunned. It was leaving. He watched it the way one watches the last flicker of a candle, not because it changes anything, but because witnessing feels like the last courtesy you can offer. He felt strange, then hollow and full at the same time, like grief and relief had braided themselves together in his chest and didn't know who should lead. The hitchhiker's voice came softer now, almost kind. "I've been here a long time. The road curves. The fog holds. People fall. Most don't want to look. So I stand where they can see me. I stay until they do." Calder's throat ached. "You're not here to scare me." "No." "To punish me?" "No." "What then?" "Oppose. Then, to accompany you." The word landed like a hand on his shoulder, gentle, human, unbearably kind. And that, finally, was what broke him. Not the mirror, not the wreck, not the word dying, but kindness arriving in the one place he thought he'd lost the right to expect it. He bowed his head over the wheel. His shoulders shook, once a controlled, embarrassed tremor the way men cry when they don't believe they're allowed the full weight of it. The fog pressed gently against the windows, not hurrying him, not selling him anything, just waiting. After a while, seconds or years, Calder lifted his head. His knuckles loosened their grip on the wheel. He looked again into the mirror, not to argue this time, not to negotiate, but because it felt rude. Suddenly, not to say goodbye to the body that had carried him all those miles. The face down in the ravine seemed almost peaceful now, smudged with dirt, freed of worry. Tiredness finally granted a place to rest. "Guess I did all right," Calder murmured, not asking for reassurance, just speaking a small truth to the white. The hitchhiker appeared beside the truck again, closer, this time fog parting around him like a curtain honoring an entrance. He didn't reach for Calder. He didn't beckon. He simply opened the passenger door wider, a courteous gesture the way you would for an old friend who'd taken too long to leave a beloved room. Calder sat there a moment longer, listening to the faint hum of the engine, to the far-off throb of waves eating their way gently into cliffs, to the soft static of fog where air learns to lose its edges. He placed one hand on the dashboard the way sailors pat the hull when coming ashore. "Thank you," he whispered to the truck, to the miles, to the life. Then very carefully he turned off the engine. The hum died, the cab exhaled, and for the first time since he'd picked the stranger up, the silence belonged wholly to the fog. Calder opened the driver's door. The world outside felt cool and dense and strangely kind, like walking into clean sheets that smelled faintly of rain. The road, the idea of it stretched in both directions as memory only. But beneath his boots, the fog held firm. He took one step, then another. The hitchhiker fell into stride beside him, not leading, not following, simply walking with him. They didn't look back. They didn't need to, because the road that wasn't a road had already done what roads do best, taken him exactly where he was always meant to arrive. Fog has a weight when you stop pretending it's only weather. It presses not downward, but inward gently until the hard edges of the world soften and the things you were afraid to name can finally be held without cutting your hands. Calder walked in that softness. Not far, not fast, just forward. The hitchhiker walked beside him, boots barely whispering against a ground that didn't quite exist anymore except as a courtesy. Their shoulders never touched, but the space between them felt warm, the way a porch light feels warm when you pull into the driveway late and tired. Calder didn't ask where they were going. Sometimes you stop asking, because asking would only make the answer smaller. After a while, a breath, a mile, a lifetime, he became aware of something ahead of them in the white. Not a structure, not a wall, a thinning, like the fog had learned to be polite and was stepping aside. The hitchhiker slowed. Calder slowed with him. They stopped together at the edge of something he couldn't see, but could feel a boundary as real as a cliff edge and as gentle as a bedsheet turned down for sleeping. The hitchhiker turned to face him. Up close, the man's eyes carried the ocean's patience, the kind that knows it will outlast whatever you're worried about. "This is where I leave you," he said softly. Calder searched his face. There was no judgment there, no ledger, no scales waiting to be balanced, just witness. He swallowed. "What's on the other side?" A small smile, the kind that doesn't disturb the rest of the face. "Whatever makes sense of you." Calder let out a breath he'd been guarding his whole life. "Do you come with me?" The hitchhiker shook his head gently. "I've got bends to stand at, people to meet. Some take longer than others." A pause. "Some never look." Calder nodded. Of course, he'd always known the job didn't end. Not really. He looked past the man into the brightening whiteness, and suddenly, without movement, the world offered him a kindness. He saw the mirror, one last time. Not glass, not frame, just the idea of it. And in it, not the ravine, not the wreck, not the broken geometry of metal and bone. He saw every mile he had ever driven, every dawn that rose out of the ocean like a coin flipped by some patient giant, every empty diner at 4 a.m., where the coffee tasted like survival, every phone call he took at rest stops, leaning against the hood, pretending he wasn't lonely, every quiet act of ordinary goodness that never makes the news. He saw his life, not perfect, but lived, and the mirror didn't ask him to apologize for it. It simply showed what had been true. His throat tightened, not with fear, but with something close to gratitude. He turned back to the hitchhiker. "Thank you," he said. The man accepted the words as if they were a small bird he knew how to hold without hurting. "You're welcome," he replied. "You were good company." Calder huffed a soft laugh. "So were you." They stood there a moment longer, letting the silence be a witness. Then Calder stepped forward. The fog parted respectful, almost affectionate, and what lay beyond wasn't a tunnel or a hall or a gate. It was simply relief. Relief like sliding into warm water after a long, cold day. Relief like setting down a weight you'd forgotten you were carrying. Relief like finally being allowed to rest without keeping one ear open for the world. He didn't disappear. He didn't dissolve. He simply went where the road had always been leading. The fog closed behind him with the soft finality of a book finding its last page. The hitchhiker stood alone again. For a time, there was only white. Then the night remembered its shape. The coastal highway revealed itself in slow, shy strokes. Sodium lights blurred into halos. The hiss of the ocean stitched itself back into the dark. The mirror, wherever it lived, now went back to being only glass. And somewhere, at a bend where the road forgets where it ends and the fog remembers everything, a quiet figure in a long coat waits, not to frighten, not to judge, only to walk a little way with those who need it, because nobody should have to notice the truth alone. The attic drawing. The house had a way of settling at night. The beams would sigh, long and slow, like an elderly relative easing into a chair. Pipes clicked in the walls. The wind threaded itself through the gingerbread trim along the eaves and made a soft whistling sound that sometimes turned into a voice if you listened too hard. Nathan Hale told himself that was part of the charm. You didn't buy a Victorian to feel safe. You bought it because it had a face. This one had a kind one. Tall windows, peeling sea green paint, a little round attic window like a watching eye, half hidden behind the leaves of an old maple tree. Milo had called it the lighthouse the first time he saw it, and the name stuck. They moved in on a Thursday. By Saturday, the house already smelled like them laundry detergent and coffee and the faint sweetbread scent of the cereal Milo insisted on eating out of a mug. Boxes colonized the downstairs rooms in bewildered stacks. Every surface seemed to be temporarily holding something that belonged somewhere else. Life felt like a half-finished map, except the attic. The attic waited. Nathan hadn't gone up there yet, not really. He'd opened the hatch during the inspection, shined a flashlight around, noted the dust and the beams and the long, low shadows, enough to check a box on a form, not enough to feel like the space had told him its story. Milo found it first. "Dad?" the boy called on Sunday morning, voice bright and echoing down the hallway. "Can I go look at the lighthouse?" "The what?" Nathan asked, then laughed. "Right. Yeah. Don't touch any nails." He listened to the small thump, thump, thump of sneakers on the attic steps and told himself the twist in his chest was responsibility, not fear. He started unpacking another kitchen box. A few minutes later, "Dad." This time, it wasn't the look at this voice. It was the come-see one. Nathan wiped his hands on a towel and climbed the narrow stairs. The attic smelled like old wood and warm dust, that dry, papery scent of forgotten things. Light filtered in through the tiny round window, turning floating dust motes into slow-moving stars. Milo sat cross-legged on the floor beside an old trunk, a black-covered sketchbook open on his lap. The pages were yellow with age. The spine had cracked and softened with handling. "I didn't break it," Milo said automatically. "I know," Nathan replied, kneeling. "What do you got there?" "A drawing book." Milo turned the sketchpad toward him. Childlike drawings filled the page, thick pencil strokes, wobbly proportions, hands without enough fingers. It could have been any kid, any year, except for the figure. Every picture had one. Tall, very tall, stick-thin arms, and where the face should have been, nothing, just a blank oval, shaded dark. In one drawing, the tall figure stood in a corner while a smaller child slept in a bed across the room. In another, it stood half behind a door. In another still, it crouched at the foot of the bed, impossibly long arms resting on the floorboards. Nathan felt his scalp prickle a sensation like a cold coin being dragged slowly across the skin. "Creepy," he said lightly, because humor makes better armor than honesty. Someone had an imagination. "He's a friend," Milo said calmly. Nathan blinked. "Who is?" Milo tapped the faceless figure with one small fingernail. "Him." There was no fear in his voice, just certainty. Nathan swallowed. "Where'd you hear that?" Milo shrugged. "He stands in my room. Sometimes." The attic seemed to lean in around them beams, listening, dust pausing in the air. Nathan forced a smile that felt like it belonged to a stranger wearing his face. "Milo," he said gently, "you know that's not real. Just dreams. Moving is weird. Brains get noisy when we're in new places." Milo considered this seriously, then said, "He's too tall for dreams," and turned another page. More drawings, more corners, more blank faces. Nathan closed the sketchbook softly. "That's enough for now, buddy. Let's bring it downstairs. Your mom will want to see." Milo nodded, already halfway down the stairs, chattering about the cereal mug and the cat shaped like a loaf that lived 2 doors down. Nathan stayed in the attic a moment longer, listening. The old house exhaled. A board creaked, not underfoot. Not near the stairs, but in the far corner beneath the little round window, the place where the shadows pooled darkest. When he finally went back down, he did not look behind him. The first night Milo cried out. It was almost a relief. Relief is the wrong word, but it fits. Fear makes more sense when it finally raises its hand. Nathan was halfway asleep when Milo's voice broke through the wall. Not a scream, just a soft, startled, "Dad?" Like a boy waking from a too-deep nap. Nathan crossed the hallway barefoot, floorboards cool and old beneath his feet. He opened Milo's door. The room smelled faintly of new paint and cardboard and that dusty sweetness from the attic. Like the two spaces were sharing their breath. Milo sat up in bed, wide-eyed. "He's there," he whispered, pointing to the corner by the bookshelf. The corner was dark, not darker than any other corner, just relevant. Nathan stepped inside. His shadow slid long across the rug. "There's no one here, champ." "He was," Milo insisted. "He watches so I don't get lonely." Nathan's jaw clenched. "That's not..." Then he saw the floor. The varnished oak boards beside the bookshelf had faint scratches in them, not deep, not dramatic, just thin. Parallel lines like something had dragged across the wood, fresh enough that the edges were pale, as if the surface had been scored recently. He crouched, touched them. They were real. The house settled. A soft sound. Almost a sigh. Nathan straightened slowly. "Go back to sleep," he said. His voice sounded wrong, like it belonged to a recording of him from a safer life. He turned off the light, paused, turned it back on again. The scratches were still there. Milo lay back down, calm now, trusting him in the uncomplicated way only children and animals do. Nathan forced himself to walk back to bed. He didn't sleep. He listened, all night, and somewhere between the breaths of the old house, he thought he heard a faint, patient dragging sound coming from the corner of his son's room, where the boards were softest, where the drawings had placed the friend. By Monday, the house had learned their names. It said Nathan in the way the floorboard dipped just enough under his heel outside the bathroom. It said Eliza in the way the kitchen window stuck unless she opened it with both hands and a small noise in her throat. It said Milo most clearly of all, soft thumps of small feet down the hall, the squeak of his desk chair, the way his laughter found corners and filled them like light. And every morning, the floor beside Milo's bookshelf carried new lines, thin, deliberate, as though someone or something with long fingers and too much time was testing the grain. Eliza noticed first. She knelt in the corner in her worn sweater, tracing the grooves with her thumb. "These weren't here yesterday," she murmured. Nathan was already tired of that sentence. "They're old," he said. "Victorian floors, everything scratched." Eliza tilted her head. "Fresh wood is pale," she replied quietly. "These are pale." He didn't answer. Milo came in carrying the sketchbook, like a priest carries a relic carefully, respectfully, with both hands. "Look," he said. I made him better. They turned. The page showed the same tall, figure-blank face, long arms, but now the lines were straighter. The proportions, cleaner. Less like a child's accident and more like a child copying something he could see clearly. Beside the figure, Milo had drawn their house, right down to the round attic window and the waving maple tree. The tall, faceless friend stood in the corner of Milo's drawn bedroom, long fingers resting on the floor, each fingertip leaving a little cluster of short, straight marks exactly where the scratches were appearing in real life. Nathan swallowed. "You're getting good," he said. "Because sometimes the truth you choose to speak is the truth that doesn't bleed." Eliza smiled, but the smile had a seam down the middle. "Who is he?" she asked gently. Milo thought for a moment, then said, with the absolute confidence of the very young, "He lives here. He was here first. He doesn't want me to be scared." "That's nice of him," Eliza said, but her hand never left the scratches. That night, Nathan dreamed of footsteps in the attic, not walking, arranging. He woke with his heart hammering and the taste of dust in his mouth. The clock said 3:07 a.m. He lay there listening. The house lay too still, like a child pretending to be asleep. He swung his feet onto the floor. The boards were cold, shockingly so, as if winter had chosen a single plank and stored itself there out of spite. He crossed the hall in silence. The door to Milo's room stood cracked open, letting out a ribbon of warm cereal and laundry-scented air. Nathan nudged it with 2 fingers. Milo slept on his side, one arm flung across the pillow, small mouth slightly open. Nathan's gaze slid involuntarily to the corner. He didn't see anything. Of course he didn't, but the lines had changed. They weren't random now. They formed a curve, a shallow arc in the wood grain, like something long and heavy had shifted its weight over and over again in the same patient place. He knelt. He pressed his palm flat to the floor, and something pressed back. Not pressure, not movement, just awareness. Like when you hold your hand just above another person's in the dark, not touching, and still somehow feel the presence. Nathan exhaled. "Okay," he whispered to a corner that did not need the courtesy of sound. "Okay, I know you're there. That's enough." The house responded with a soft tick from the radiator and the distant sigh of wind through the eaves, which was to say, nothing at all. He stood, went back to bed, and dreamed once more of footsteps in the attic, except now he knew they were not footsteps. They were fingertips. By Wednesday, Milo had filled half the sketchbook. Each page was another proof. The tall, faceless friend in the kitchen doorway. The friend sitting on the rug while Milo built a tower of blocks. The friend by the front door when Eliza tied Milo's shoes before school. Always still. Always in the corner. Always just out of the place where anyone but Milo might think to look. Nathan started to feel watched in his own home. He caught himself pausing in doorways and glancing automatically to the corners. A new reflex. Like when you've walked into a spiderweb once and now you flinch at every thread of air. One evening, while Eliza washed dishes and Milo colored at the table, Nathan took the sketchbook out to the porch. He sat on the top step, the old wood warm with leftover sun. He flipped through slowly. The paper whispered under his fingers. Toward the back of the book, the drawings changed. The pencil work sharpened. The artist, some long-vanished child who had lived in this house before the Hales even existed, had begun to draw words. Not many, just captions. Under one drawing, the faceless friend in a closet doorway, a child's handwriting spelled, "He stands where the room forgets to look." Nathan's skin prickled head to toe. He turned the page. Another picture, the friend at the foot of the bed. Caption, "Don't notice him. Don't notice him. I don't notice him." The words had been written 3 times, pressing deeper into the page each time. The last line nearly tearing the paper. Nathan shut the book gently. The porch boards creaked behind him. He turned, half expecting, but it was only Eliza, drying her hands on a tea towel. "I don't like that thing," she said quietly. He held her gaze a long moment. "Me neither," he answered. "They didn't tell Milo, because how do you warn a child about the space in her room?" That night, Nathan woke to a sound he could not name. Not quite a scrape, not quite a sigh. A soft, deliberate drag, followed by stillness. He stood in the hallway, heart pounding, the air cool and clean as if the house had opened lungs it hadn't used in decades. He took one step toward Milo's room, then another. The door was open again, always open now. He stopped in the doorway, and for the first time, he smelled it. Not rot, not damp, something like old paper and raincoats hung in a closed room. The scent of things that have waited too long. Milo stirred, muttered something friendly to his dreams, and rolled over. Nathan's gaze flicked to the corner and froze, because the scratches had formed a shape, a semicircle, like the worn mark a rocking chair leaves over a century of gentle back and forth. Except Milo didn't have a rocking chair. He just had a visitor with long, patient arms and nowhere else to be. Nathan closed his eyes, called every adult thought he had ever owned to the front of his mind like soldiers. It's the house shifting. It's us. It's stress. It's imagination finding purchase. But beneath all that reassurance, another truth whispered up from the floorboards. You are being allowed to notice this. Now you cannot unnotice it. And from that night on, Nathan Hale stopped walking past corners without looking. By the end of the second week, the Hale family had a routine. Morning coffee, school drop-off, boxes unpacked one room at a time, and every day, when Nathan entered Milo's bedroom to open the curtains and let the light in, he would glance, without meaning to, at the corner beside the bookshelf. And every day, the scratches in the floor had grown, not wildly, Not dramatically, incrementally, as if the floor were a diary that only wrote a single word per night. Eliza stopped pretending not to see them. She would crouch in that corner after Milo left for school, fingertips hovering an inch above the pale, raw lines. Sometimes she pressed one finger gently into the grooves the way a person might trace a scar and whisper to herself, "Please don't," as though the house might hear her, as though something might listen. It was a Thursday, when the drawings changed. Milo came home from school, with his backpack hanging crooked off one shoulder, shoes untied in the way that drove Eliza gently mad. He went straight to the kitchen table, pulled out the sketchbook, and began to draw with the quiet focus of someone performing a known task. Eliza chopped carrots. The knife thudded softly against the cutting board. She didn't look up until Milo said, "Mom?" He moved. The knife paused mid-stroke. Eliza's chest tightened. She turned. Milo held up the book. In this drawing, the faceless figure no longer stood in the corner. He stood by Milo's bed. One long arm rested across the mattress, fingertips brushing the little drawn comforter as though testing the texture. And the bed in the picture, had the exact same rocket ship duvet Milo slept under now, right down to the little tear in the seam near the pillow. Eliza's mouth went dry. "Honey," she said carefully, "when did you draw this?" "Now," Milo replied cheerfully. "He asked me to." The kitchen suddenly felt too small for its walls. Eliza steadied herself against the counter. "What do you mean?" "Asked you." "He doesn't use words," Milo said, like this was something a grown-up should already understand. "He just stands where he wants me to draw him. So I do. Otherwise he gets sad." Eliza crouched, bringing herself to Milo's eye level. "Does he scare you?" Milo considered. "No," he said. "He scares you," and returned calmly to shading in the corner of the page. Eliza didn't reply. She only stood there, hands trembling around the knife, watching her son draw their lives as though the house itself had given him the assignment. That night, the house had new sounds. Not footsteps, not the friendly tick-tick of pipes warming. These sounds were smaller, as if something with long limbs was being careful. Nathan heard them first, faint as moth wings against glass. A shift, a drag, a placing. He sat up in bed. Eliza was already awake beside him, eyes wide in the dark. "You hear it too," she whispered. He nodded. They listened. Something moved in the ceiling joists, directly above Milo's room, slowly, lovingly, like furniture being arranged around a bed. Nathan swung his feet to the floor. "Don't," Eliza murmured, catching his wrist. "What if?" He forced a smile he did not believe in. "We're the parents," he said. "We have to." He climbed the attic, steps alone. Each board breathed under his weight. The air up there was cold and old and full of the scent of dust that has learned to keep secrets. He flicked on the little bulb that dangled from a frayed cord near the hatch. The light revealed beams and trunks and boxes that had belonged to strangers, and something else. Marks, pale scratches in the old attic boards. Not random, not chaotic. They formed a circle, directly above where Milo's bed sat below. Nathan knelt. The circle wasn't perfect, handmade, uneven, but it was undeniably deliberate. The wood inside the circle looked smoother, as though weight had been resting there. Night after night after night, he pressed his palm flat inside the ring. It was cold, not attic cold, not winter cold, a deep, interior cold like putting your hand down on a stone that has never seen the sun. Nathan swallowed. The bulb flickered. He turned. For one impossible heartbeat, he thought he saw a shape in the round attic window, something tall, close, watching with the patient interest of a librarian reading over his shoulder. He blinked. It was gone. Only his own reflection remained. Faint and unconvincing. He went back downstairs. He didn't tell Eliza about the circle. He didn't have the right words for it yet. He only said, "It's nothing. Old wood." Because sometimes the most cowardly thing you can do is try to be reassuring. The next morning, Eliza found something on the kitchen table. The sketchbook, open, waiting. They never left it out. They were careful about that now, about what Milo saw before school, what he carried with him into daylight. But there it was, and the picture was new. Graphite still smudged faintly, where a small hand had dragged the side of its palm across the page. It showed the master bedroom, Nathan and Eliza's room, their bed, her nightstand lamp, Nathan's heap of folded laundry he kept promising to put away, and in the far corner of the drawn room, the familiar tall shape. Only now, the figure was closer to the bed, long arms resting on the mattress, blank face tilted, watching. Eliza clapped a hand over her mouth. Tears sprang without asking permission, because there, sketched in pencil-soft lines just beneath the leaning shadow figure, was her, sleeping, hair splayed across the pillow, mouth slightly open. Completely unaware, she heard a noise and turned sharply. Milo stood in the doorway, bare feet, pajamas wrinkled, morning soft. "Did you draw this?" she whispered. He nodded. "He asked me to finish it before school." Her voice came out thinner than paper. "When?" Milo smiled. "Just now." Eliza looked at the page again, at the shading, at the detail, at the way the blanket fell exactly as it had when she got out of bed 10 minutes ago. And she realized with a slow, crushing certainty that the drawings were no longer old. They were current. The sketchbook hadn't been waiting for Milo. It had been waiting for the house to have someone small enough to listen. That afternoon, Nathan came home early from work, jaw tight, skin pale. He placed something on the table beside the book, a folded sheet of paper, yellowed, thick, carefully torn from a different notebook. He smoothed it out with shaking hands. "It was wedged behind the attic beams," he said. "Hidden." Eliza leaned in. The handwriting was childlike, but older than Milo's, more controlled. Letters pressed hard into the page. "If you can read this, don't let him in the corners. Don't let him draw you. Don't let him lean." The last word was underlined again and again until the pencil had nearly torn the paper. "Don't let him lean." Eliza stared at the message, heart pounding. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Nathan looked toward the hallway, toward Milo's room, toward that corner of the house that always seemed to be waiting. "I think," he said quietly, "it means we're already too late." Nathan didn't sleep anymore. He lay beside Eliza at night and stared at the ceiling, at the faint hair-lined cracks that spidered out from the light fixture like veins. He counted every tick of the house, every sigh of the old boards, every whisper of wind through the maple leaves. And always, always he waited for the sound. The drag, soft, measured, like fingertips tracing the grain of the floor. It came every night now, not only in Milo's room, everywhere. The living room, the hallway, outside their bedroom door. Slow, thoughtful paths etched into the house's memory. In the mornings, they found evidence. Little patches of pale wood showing through the varnish where something had pressed and scraped with inhuman patience. Eliza began wearing slippers in the house. Not for warmth, just so she didn't have to feel the grooves under her feet. Nathan started reading the sketchbook properly, not skimming, studying. He sat at the kitchen table after Milo went to bed, the only light the lamp above him, while the house listened with the attentiveness of a creature that understands it is being discussed. Page after page of drawings, some crude, some strangely beautiful, traced the relationship between the house's child and its tall, faceless guest. At first, the captions were friendly. "He likes company. He doesn't mind waiting." Then, they changed. The handwriting became frantic. Letters pressed deep into the paper. The child had begun to warn their future self. "Warn anyone who might find this book. Don't look too long. He leans when you sleep. He leans because it's easier." Nathan rubbed at his eyes. The words swam. He flipped further into the last third of the book. The drawings there were worse. Not frightening, exactly, but intimate. The tall, faceless figure close to the child's bed now. Not in the corner. Not apart. Hunched, bent, arms long, elbows sharp, body angled, leaning over the bed like a shadow trying to remember how to be human. Fingers splayed across the blankets. Not holding, not harming, just settling, like someone who's been standing for too long. Nathan's mouth went dry. He heard Eliza behind him. "What does it mean?" she whispered. He didn't answer, because now he knew. The scratches, the curves in the floor, the cold patch in the attic. Leaning, it didn't stand in the corner forever. It watched, it waited, and when you stopped believing in the corner, when it had become part of your life, as ordinary as the smell of coffee or the sound of Milo running down the hall, it leaned. It shared the space beside the bed. Because leaning is what familiarity allows. The first night Nathan felt the mattress dip. He almost convinced himself he was dreaming. Almost. It was subtle, like a cat jumping up onto the bed and settling somewhere near his calves. Except they didn't have a cat. The room was dark. The sounds in the house had layered themselves into a lullaby of old wood and moving air. Eliza breathed softly beside him, and somewhere near the edge of the mattress, the weight remained. Not heavy, not threatening, just present. Nathan didn't move, didn't open his eyes, didn't breathe too deeply. He stared at the back of his eyelids and thought of the words in the book. Don't let him lean. He counted. 1, 2, 3. After a while, a minute, an hour, he couldn't tell the weight lifted again. So slowly it was almost kind, like someone careful not to wake him. The next morning, there were faint scratches on the hardwood beside his side of the bed. Only 3 or 4. Thin, curved, as though something had braced itself there. Fingertips tasting the wood. Eliza saw them. Her hand fluttered to her chest. Nathan, I know, he said, and that was worse than denial, because now they shared the truth, and the house enjoyed being noticed. Milo began sleeping through the night again. That frightened Eliza more than the crying had. He looked rested now, almost serene. He told them, over cereal, that his friend didn't have to stand so far away anymore. He trusts us, Milo said. Nathan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What do you mean, trusts us? He used to stay in the corners, Milo explained patiently, like a teacher, because that's where people don't look. But if you don't look at him, you forget he's there, and then he gets lonely. So now he sits closer. Where? Eliza asked. Her voice was hushed without meaning to be. Milo smiled. Where it's warm. Nathan excused himself and walked into the hallway before he broke the world open in front of his son. He leaned against the wall. The plaster was cool. For a moment, just a sliver of time, he thought he felt someone else's shoulder rest lightly against the other side of the wall, matching his weight. Companionable, a mimicry of comfort. He pushed away quickly. The wall creaked. The sound traveled a ripple through the house floorboards, reacting one by one like vertebrae coming gently back into alignment. That night, Eliza dreamed she was a child again, in her grandmother's spare bedroom, the wallpaper yellowed with roses. She dreamed of lying still under the thin quilt while a long shadow bent over her, smelling of old paper and rain. She dreamed it whispered, not words, just a feeling of patience so old it had worn grooves in time. She woke with a start, her heart hammered. Nathan slept beside her, face turned toward the wall. The house was very quiet, very still, until it wasn't. Dip. The mattress gave slightly behind her knees. Not firmly, only as much as a resting arm might. She stared into the dark, eyes wide, breath caught like thread on a nail. She didn't turn, didn't scream, didn't wake Nathan. She simply lay there while something tall and faceless learned the shape of their bed. And in the morning, there were scratches on her side too, curved, patient, like parentheses holding a sentence she did not want to read. They tried to be rational. Of course they did. They talked about old wood, and settling beams, and stress, and shared delusions, and the contagious nature of fear. Nathan suggested therapy. Eliza suggested selling. Neither of them said the real thing out loud. What if he follows? Because you can leave a house, but it's harder to leave a corner. The day the pages began to change on their own, Nathan stopped pretending entirely. He found the sketchbook on Milo's desk after school, open to the same drawing as the day before. The 3 of them at the dinner table. The tall, faceless figure in the corner. Polite as always, but the shading was darker. The pencil strokes deeper. Someone had gone back over the lines, strengthening them, clarifying them. Milo hadn't been home. Eliza hadn't touched it. The graphite felt fresh when Nathan ran a fingertip across it like it would smudge if you weren't careful. He turned the page. The next picture, empty yesterday, now held the beginning of a new drawing. Just the faint outline of a bed. Their bed. A long figure leaning. Blank face lowered toward the pillow, toward a sketched shape that hadn't been filled in yet. A shape that would clearly be a sleeping man. Nathan shut the book. His hand shook so badly the cover thudded against the table. He pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes until light burst in colors. And in the silence of the house, the polite, listening silence, He finally said it, out loud, to the walls, to the corners, to the thing that had been so patient for so long. "Please," he whispered. The words sounded small. "Please don't." The house breathed. Pipes clicked. Floorboards settled. From upstairs, faintly, a long, slow drag answered him. Gentle, unhurried, reassuring almost. "I'm already here." The first thing Nathan noticed that morning was the absence of weight. No dip in the mattress. No cool air at the back of his knees. Just stillness. Ordinary, breathable stillness. Sunlight gathered gently at the edges of the curtains. A car went past outside. Somewhere in the house, a pipe made a small, embarrassed click. Eliza slept on, hand tucked beneath her cheek, lashes resting on the soft half-moons beneath her eyes. For a moment, Nathan let himself believe. Maybe it had passed. Maybe the house had gotten bored. Maybe Milo had outgrown his friend, the way children do. Maybe. A soft sound broke the thought. Not the drag. Not this time. Paper. Turning. Slow. Deliberate. From down the hall, Nathan's body moved before his mind did. Bare feet, unvarnished wood, dust-washed morning light. A hallway that felt exactly as long as guilt. Milo's bedroom door stood halfway open. As it always did, the Hale compromise between privacy and reassurance. A strip of light lay across the rug like ribbon. Nathan nudged the door wider. Milo sat cross-legged on the floor in his rocket ship pajamas, hair bent into sleep-weird angles. And in his lap, the sketchbook, open, waiting. Nathan swallowed. "What are you drawing, buddy?" Milo didn't look up. "Not drawing," he said calmly. He finished it. Nathan's heart tilted in his chest. "Who did?" "My friend." Milo turned the book toward him, and the world became very, very quiet. It was a new page, graphite soft as breath, lines careful, deliberate, almost tender. The scene was unmistakable. Nathan and Eliza's bedroom, their real one with the same scuffed dresser, the same too-small rug, the same crooked picture frame Eliza kept meaning to straighten. The tall, faceless figure leaned over the bed. One long arm rested on the mattress, blank face tilted toward the pillows, toward a sleeping shape on the nearer side of the bed. The shape was Nathan, even in graphite. He recognized himself, the slope of his shoulders, the fall of his hair, the way his hand curled lightly when he slept, as though still holding the day. The shading was perfect, the perspective correct, the blanket rumpled exactly as it had been when he rose moments ago. He stared. He couldn't breathe. Very slowly, he turned the page back one. The drawing before this one had been untouched last night, but now it was complete too. It showed Eliza, sleeping on her side, the faceless figure leaning from the far corner, long fingers almost brushing her hair. The pencil work around the fingers was darker, pressed harder, as if the hand had gone back. Again and again, to remember the shape of leaning. Nathan flipped further back, page after page updated. Corridors, doorways, the kitchen, the attic, all finished now. Every empty space, carefully filled. Every corner occupied. He turned to the very back of the book. There had always been a blank page there, warped slightly with age. Waiting. Now, it wasn't blank. A single drawing filled the page. No shading, no room, no bed, just a figure. Tall, faceless, arms long enough to reach the floor, and beneath it, in small, careful child letters, a caption. "He leans to see how you breathe." Nathan's skin prickled from scalp to heel. Very gently, he took the book from Milo's lap. "Where were you when you finished these?" he asked, keeping his voice level with an effort that felt like lifting a car. Milo blinked up at him. "In your room," he said. "I couldn't sleep. He told me to come watch, so I didn't feel lonely." Nathan's jaw locked. "Watch what?" Milo smiled. "The drawings. Like Stanton." He said it the way you might say the word stars. Simple. Beautiful. True. Nathan closed the book. His hands had begun to shake. He stood. Walked, not ran. Because running might make it real back to the master bedroom. Eliza still slept. The room smelled like morning and coffee grounds and the faint, dusty sweetness that now belonged to every corner of the house. Nathan stepped to the side of the bed, very slowly. He lowered himself onto the mattress. Dip. There it was. He went still. The weight settled near his thighs, light, exploratory, companionable. He could feel the patience of it, the way it had learned them, their rhythms, their softest parts. He didn't look. He didn't dare. He only stared at the wall, every nerve lit like wire. Behind him, the mattress shifted again, infinitesimally, as though something tall and tired were leaning once more. Long arms braced against pale wood floors, scrolled with loving, patient scratches. A kindness, a study, a vigil. He thought of the attic circle, of the warning written decades ago. Don't let him lean. And he understood, finally, what the sentence hadn't had room to say. You don't let him. You forget not to. You make room for the corner, for the watcher, for the witness that never blinks. And once the house has taught you how to live with him, he doesn't need the corner anymore. He knows where you sleep. He knows the soft spots in the mattress. He knows how to balance his weight so the bed only dips a little. He leans, because leaning is what friends do when they sit beside your bed. The weight stayed for a very long time. Not crushing, not cruel, just there, listening to how he breathed, learning him. Milo padded quietly into the doorway a few minutes later, the sketchbook pressed to his chest. Dad? Nathan didn't trust his voice. He only nodded. Milo smiled, relieved, as if some unspoken promise had been kept. He likes you, he said gently. Behind Nathan, the bed dipped once more, ever so slightly, an affectionate adjustment as something tall and faceless settled just a little closer, so it could see him better. If you're still with me, you've traveled a long way through the dark tonight. You've ridden lonely roads that never quite remembered where they were going. You've walked hospital corridors that echo with laughter that shouldn't exist. You've listened to names whispered through a throat that wasn't built for prophecy. You've followed footsteps through fog, right up to the edge of the world. You've watched as the house learned your name, one quiet corner at a time. And yet you're still here, still breathing, still listening, still tethered gently to the living world by the soft hum of whatever you're playing this on. That's the thing about these stories. They don't end when we stop telling them. They fold themselves neatly away into the shadows and wait for you in the places you've always trusted. On the road home, in the hallway outside your bedroom, in the corner you never quite look at when you turn out the light. If, later tonight, you feel the bed dip just a little, or hear the soft hush of fog at your window, or wake at exactly 3 a.m. for no reason at all, don't worry. It only means the night remembers you, and somewhere out beyond the edge of the signal, a calm, patient voice is still reading the world into shape. Thank you for keeping me company in the dark. Until next time, sleep lightly and listen carefully, because the night is very good at listening back.